You wake before the sun, while the air is still cool and the shadows are soft. The lemon trees stand quiet in the half-light, their leaves catching the faintest shimmer of dew. The ground beneath them is dark with moisture from last night's irrigation, and the smell rising from it is rich, loamy, and faintly sharp from the citrus. You move slowly between the trunks, feeling the damp earth under your sandals, listening to the garden's first murmurs. Somewhere to your left, a lizard scurries over a stone wall, its claws clicking softly as it searches for early prey. You stop under a tree heavy with green fruit, tilting your head to look at the undersides of its leaves. A tiny smear of white aphid eggs most likely catches your eye. You rub them away with the edge of your thumb, then rub your fingers on the rough bark to wipe them clean. In this season, you know every day begins with inspection. The pests never sleep long, and they often start their work before you even rise. From the next row over, a faint cough drifts across the grove. That will be Yusef, the old man who tends the far lemon plots. You catch a whiff of his early morning smoke olive wood burning in a shallow pit, meant to keep beetles at bay. Historians agree that gardeners here in 5th century Syria relied heavily on smoke to disrupt insect feeding patterns. They also note with some interest that certain aromatic woods were preferred for reasons not entirely clear, perhaps because they smelled pleasant to humans, or perhaps because pests truly disliked them. You pass your hand along a lower branch, feeling the cool, waxy skin of the lemons. One slips easily into your palm. It's still unripe, its scent faint and sour. You leave it hanging better to wait until it turns gold. You hear the light tapping of a thrush above you, plucking at a beetle hidden among the leaves, a small, living ally in your constant work. Near the grove's edge, the sun's rim finally peaks over the low eastern hills. The light catches the fine threads of a spider's web strung between two branches. You crouch to study it, noting how the delicate strands shimmer like a net of silver. Perhaps it has caught a few midges, another silent helper in the endless war with the swarms. And yet, not all mornings are this calm. You recall the spring 2 years past, when locusts came early and stripped half the lemon grove bare in a single day. The old men say locust years come in cycles, though they disagree on whether the moon or the rains foretell them. Historians still argue whether such cycles were truly predictable, or simply seemed so to those who endured them. For now, you let the memory fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of your steps. You move from tree to tree, your gaze soft, your fingers light on each branch. The grove hums faintly with unseen wings. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey brays. You let the sounds settle into you, blending with the scent of damp soil and the cool weight of the morning air. The day has begun quietly, and you intend to keep it so, even as the first insects stir. You leave the lemon grove behind and walk toward the vineyard, following a narrow path worn into the soil by years of footsteps. The early light lays long shadows over the ground, and the cool air still holds the night's dampness. The vines stand in neat rows, their twisted trunks dark against the pale earth. You step carefully between them, mindful not to disturb the dew still clinging to their leaves. Each leaf catches your eye for a moment. Some are broad and perfect, untouched by pest or weather. Others bear small holes or ragged edges, a sign that caterpillars have passed this way. You lift one leaf and find the culprit still there, pale green and sluggish from the cool night. With a practiced flick of your finger, you send it tumbling to the soil, where it will not climb again. The air here smells different than in the lemon grove, less sharp, more earthy, with a faint sweetness from the grape clusters beginning to form. You bend low to examine one cluster, still no larger than your thumb. Tiny specks of early mildew appear on a few berries, a reminder that damp mornings, while gentle, also bring their own troubles. You rub them lightly between your fingers and think of the work ahead. From across the vineyard, a wooden rattle sounds 3 short bursts. It is Farid, the young man who tends the far rows, sending a warning that starlings are gathering on the hillside. In this place and time, gardeners knew the sound of approaching pests as well as they knew the voices of their neighbors. Historians agree that starlings were among the most persistent grape thieves, often arriving in great clouds just before harvest. You pause beside a post where a vine curls upward, its tendrils gripping the wood like small fingers. The texture is rough under your touch. Above, the sky is pale but brightening, and the thin clouds hint at another warm day. Your ears catch a faint buzzing near your head, a bee, drifting lazily between blossoms. You smile at its work. Not all visitors are thieves. At the edge of one row, you crouch to examine the soil. A few fresh tunnels mark where beetles have burrowed during the night. You take a small stick from your belt and disturb the entrance, collapsing it before they can emerge in numbers. Whether it helps much is uncertain. Some say it makes no difference, but it is a habit you keep nonetheless. Historians still debate how effective such simple measures were in truly controlling pests. The sound of the rattle comes again, farther off now. You straighten slowly, feeling the weight of the morning settle into your limbs. The vineyard stretches quietly around you, green and orderly, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call to break the stillness. You think of the hours ahead, more inspection, more small acts of care, each one invisible in the moment, but together, the difference between a fruitful season and a hungry winter. The sun climbs a little higher, warming the back of your neck. A breeze stirs, carrying the faint scent of dust from the road beyond the vineyard. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleats, answered by another. You linger in this row for a few breaths longer, letting the quiet sink into you. The swarms may come, but for now, the vines stand steady, and your hands are ready. You smell the smoke before you see it. It threads across the orchard like pale cloth, curling low between the olive trunks, moving as slowly as a drowsy animal. You follow the path toward the source, stepping over a basket and a coil of rope left like a sleeping snake. Somewhere in the haze, a log sighs and collapses. A small wing of sparks lifts, glows, and vanishes. You part the veil and breathe through your sleeve. Yusef is crouched by a shallow trench, coaxing a fire that is not meant to blaze. He feeds it olive twigs and damp leaves, letting it brood rather than flare. The smoke rolls out in a steady band and touches the lower branches, where beetles patrol as if they own the place. You ease onto a stone and listen to the crisp talk of embers. The smell is leathery and green at once, touched with last year's prunings. You close your eyes and count breaths until the haze settles into something companionable. Olive trees have stood in these hills longer than anyone remembers. Historians agree that in late antiquity, gardeners across Syria used slow fires in orchards to distract or repel insects, especially at dawn and dusk when feeding peaks. The method was cheap, familiar, and easily adjusted to wind. They also note that olive and fig woods were commonly favored ready at hand, and it seems unsettling to certain pests. From a branch above the trench hangs a blackened clay lamp, tied with frayed cord. Its little tongue of flame is hardly needed now, but Yusef keeps it as a talisman of steadiness. When the breeze shifts, the smoke thins and the wick brightens, and you glimpse small shapes skittering along the shaded side of a trunk. You tap the bark with a knuckle. One beetle freezes. Another lets go and drops neat as a pebble into the ash ridge. You pinch it, flick it into the coals, and hear only the hiss of its tiny oil. Yusef tells again, because he always tells again, how a west wind once carried a brown film over his cousin's lower field, how the lemons turned lace before the noon bell. He speaks as if bored with his own memory, and you nod because nodding is part of the work. The smoke drifts, and a gecko, chalk still until now, scuttles from a crack and takes 3 midges in 4 heartbeats. You lift a bundle of twigs from the basket. Slowly, you lay them so they do not smother the coals. The fire answers with a soft, patient sound, as if breathing. The haze wraps your ankles. Somewhere beyond the grove, a shepherd calls, and a ewe replies like an old hinge. A fringe practice creeps into your thoughts, the one you mention, only when you need a laugh. Hanging fish skins on the outer branches when pests are worst, letting them mature in the sun until they speak for themselves. You tried it once. The smell drove away more visitors than you intended, human, goat, and insect alike. Still, you keep a jar of strips for the week when nothing else will listen. Yusef likes to crush laurel leaves with salt, dry them, and toss them into the coals for a sharp note. You stir the trench with a forked stick and feel heat push at your knuckles. Bits of leaf turn to lace as they burn, their veins standing like a map. You think of how many mornings have begun with this small ritual. Historians still argue whether routine fumigation truly limits damage over a season, or mostly comforts the gardener with the feeling of useful action. You do not bother to argue. You breathe and watch the slowdown in the insect's will. 2 starlings dip low, reconsider, and tilt away. The sun climbs enough to make the olives shine as if rubbed with oil. You and Yusef edge the trench along the driest ground, so the smoke falls evenly through the orchard. Your sandals scuff long arcs. Your hair gathers the odor of a hearth. You supervise a conversation between wood and air. You draw a little water from a clay jar and dab the inside of your nose, so the sting settles, a trick learned from a traveling mason who swore by wet cloth near lime. It serves well enough for olive smoke too. Yusef crumbles rosemary into his palm, crushes it, and casts it in. A sharp green rises above the darker base, and for a moment the grove smells like spring pretending to be today. A moth wobbles through, undecided. On the far wall, a boy runs, chases his shadow, stops to pinch his nose, and shouts that his mother forbids him to help because his hair will stink for days. You tell him the smell is the mark of victory, and he should be proud not to smell of failure. He laughs and mimes fainting. Even here there is room for a little theater. You and Yusuf talk pruning while the trench wanders. Some say cutting high branches before the next moon lowers the sap's invitation to boring beetles. Others say beetles decide without reading moons. You will do what your eyes say when the time comes. The orchard speaks slowly, and you try to listen. The fire sinks again. You add a last bundle and lay 2 damp leaves across the top to thicken the veil. A breeze slips from the east, and the smoke goes walking among the olives, patient and gray, softening outlines, softening thoughts. Your shoulders loosen, and your breath lengthens. The morning that began in lemon shade now moves with the rhythm of work done without hurry. You and the trees agree on a pace. When at last you stand, the sun has climbed a hand's breadth, and a thin shine of sweat finds your back. You press a flat stone over the trench until the glow dims. Yusef rubs his eyelids with the heel of his hand, leaves a gray smear, and smiles at nothing in particular. The smoke thins, rises, and frays into the bright. Before you leave, you lay your palm against an olive trunk and feel the night still stored beneath the bark. No buzz near your ear now, no soft scraping. You bless the tree the way you were taught, with silence and a nod, and turn toward the path. Behind you, the grove looks a shade cleaner, as if someone brushed its hair. The swarms will come again, they always do, but you carry the smell of your labor like calm armor. You return to your own garden plots with the faint perfume of olive smoke clinging to your tunic. The air is warmer now, and the morning's quiet has shifted into the low hum of insect wings. Near the center of your yard, a shallow stone basin sits waiting, its rim stained from years of use. You kneel beside it and reach for a bundle wrapped in coarse linen garlic bulbs, wild thyme, and the small, dark leaves of a plant that grows stubbornly in the rocky soil beyond the village. You crush the garlic first, splitting the papery skins with the heel of your hand. The cloves release a sharp scent that stings your nose. One by one, you drop them into the basin, then strip the thyme leaves and add them to the pile. The leaves are resinous, sticking slightly to your fingertips. You sprinkle in the darker leaves, whose name in the local tongue translates simply to bitter one. They say its taste is enough to turn away even the hungriest pest. Historians agree that gardeners in 5th century Syria often made such brews infusions of pungent herbs and roots steeped in water or vinegar to repel aphids, caterpillars, and other small intruders. They also note that while garlic and thyme appear often in records, the bitter one is harder to identify, possibly a local wild mint or wormwood. You take a round stone, smooth from years of grinding grain, and begin to crush the mixture. The sound is slow and steady, a dull rhythm against the basin's base. As you work, the colors deepen: white garlic bruising to gold, green herbs darkening to nearly black. You pour in a ladle of water drawn from the cistern and swirl the paste until the air fills with its heavy scent. A fringe practice comes to mind, adding a splash of sour goat's milk to the brew, a trick some say makes the mixture cling better to leaves. You tried it once, and the smell was enough to keep you out of the garden for 2 days. Whether it worked on the pests, you never truly discovered. The liquid is ready, when it looks like weak ink and smells like a kitchen in the middle of a feast gone wrong. You fill a clay jug and sling it by its handle, walking between rows of beans and cucumbers. The leaves glisten where the morning dew still holds. You pour a thin stream at the base of each plant, letting it soak into the soil. For the more delicate shoots, you dip a small bundle of reeds into the mixture and flick droplets across the leaves, each one clinging like a bead of amber before sliding down. The scent clings to your fingers, to your sleeves, even to your hair. A bee circles you once, hovers, then decides against landing. That, you think, is a sign the brew is working, at least for now. Historians still argue whether these mixtures truly harmed insects or merely masked the scent of the plants, confusing the pests long enough for the gardener to act. By the time you reach the melon patch, the jug is nearly empty. You swirl the last of the liquid and pour it in a wide circle around the plants, a boundary that you hope will hold at least until tomorrow. You crouch to touch the coarse leaves, their tiny hairs brushing your fingertips. They smell clean for now. The sun is higher still, the light sharper. You lean on your knees and let the warmth sink into your back. In the distance, someone is calling for a lost goat, the sound fading in and out as it bounces off the walls. A chicken scratches in the dust near your feet, looking for seeds you did not drop. You set the empty jug aside and wash your hands in a shallow bowl, the water turning cloudy with herb oils. The bitter scent lingers even as the dirt leaves your skin. You breathe it in once more, not minding its harshness. In this season, anything that keeps the swarms at bay is worth carrying with you. You walk to the fig trees at the edge of your garden, their broad leaves casting cool shadows on the dry earth. The morning breeze has faded, and the air feels still enough to hear the faint rustle of insects among the branches. You set down your basket, stand beneath the first tree, and place your hands around a low-hanging limb. The bark is warm and slightly rough beneath your palms. With a firm, practiced motion, you shake the branch. The leaves flutter like startled birds, and small shapes drop to the ground, a scatter of curled caterpillars, tiny beetles, and the occasional pale moth that takes wing before you can catch it. You step back quickly, letting the pests fall onto the sheet of coarse linen you spread earlier across the soil. Historians agree that gardeners in 5th century Syria often used simple physical methods like branch shaking to dislodge pests from fruit trees. The fallen insects could then be gathered and burned or fed to chickens. They also note that this method was particularly common in the early morning, when insects were sluggish and less likely to fly away. You repeat the motion on another branch, listening to the soft thuds of small bodies landing on the cloth. The fig leaves release a green, resinous smell as they move, mixing with the faint sweetness of ripening fruit. A bead of sap forms where a twig snapped and glistens like amber in the sunlight. You touch it with your fingertip, it clings like honey, sticky and faintly bitter. At your feet, a small army of ants swarms toward the linen, eager to claim what has fallen. You shake the cloth once to scatter them back, then kneel to inspect your catch. A pale green caterpillar curls tightly as your shadow passes over it. A beetle, shining dark like a polished seed, scrambles toward the edge. You pinch it gently between your fingers and drop it into a clay pot half filled with water. Ripples spread slowly, breaking the reflected sky. You shift to the next tree, your steps careful over the cracked soil. The heat is rising now, pressing against your shoulders. You take a moment in the shade of the broad canopy, feeling the coolness wrap around you like a thin cloak. The sound of leaves brushing together above your head is almost like whispering. A fringe trick drifts into your thoughts, one you saw in a neighboring village, tying small clay weights to the ends of branches to encourage insects to fall without constant shaking. You tried it once, but the wind snapped 2 branches before the day was done. Sometimes old ideas are better left to their old owners. You work slowly, shaking each branch in turn, moving the linen to catch the fall. The pile of pests grows steadily, the water in the pot clouding with tiny bodies. The chickens watch from the far side of the fence, tilting their heads, waiting for the moment you toss them a wriggling treat. They will have their share soon enough. Historians still argue whether fig trees of this region suffered more from moths or from beetles in this century. Some claim the greatest damage came from insects burrowing into the fruit before it ripened. Others insist that leaf damage from chewing pests weakened the trees more. You only know that either can ruin a harvest and so you keep at the work without choosing sides. By the time you finish the last tree, your forearms are lightly dusted with sap and pollen, and the scent of figs clings to your skin. The basket at your feet holds a small collection of early fruit, those that came loose in your shaking. You brush away a tiny worm from one, turning it over to find the pale scar where it tried to enter. You toss that one aside for the chickens. The cloth is folded, the pests gathered, the pot carried to the far corner where the fire pit waits. You tip them in with a quiet hiss from the damp bodies meeting embers. Smoke curls up, carrying away the morning's small victories. The trees stand calmer now, their leaves still, their branches lighter. You wipe your hands on your tunic and lift the basket. The sun is well above the horizon, and the day's heat has begun its slow, steady climb. You walk back toward the center of the garden, the smell of figs and smoke trailing behind you. You carry a stack of small clay pots to the garden's edge, each the color of warm bread. Their rims are chipped from years of service, first for oil, then for olives and brine, and now for this humbler work. You set them beside the low field wall where lizards sun themselves and blink without fear. You turn the first pot upside down and press it into the powdery soil, leaving a slim crescent where air can pass. The earth remembers last night and answers your fingers with coolness. You slide a flat sherd beneath one side so the mouth gapes just enough for crawling things to think it's shelter. A pinch of bran falls from your hand into the shadow, no more than a hint. The pot gives a hollow tick when your nail taps it, as if consenting. Ants wander in a dark beadline near the path, hauling pale crumbs twice their size. They feel the edge circle and vanish into the faint shade. You do not hurry. This practice is made of patience. Historians agree that across Syria in your century, terracotta was repurposed in gardens' amphora sherds to edge beds, whole pots inverted as cool hollows that became accidental snares. The method is older than your own memory, carried from hands to hands the way a tune is carried. At the lemon grove you shook. At the fig trees you rattled. Here at the margins you invite rather than evict. You place another pot near the cucumbers where the soil keeps a gentle damp. You wet a fingertip and touch the rim so dust turns to a thin ring of clay. The chickens watch from the path, unimpressed. The hound noses the pot, sneezes at the smell of old vinegar, and wanders off to stalk a lizard he will never catch. For the next trap, you smear the inner curve with date syrup thinned in a few drops of sour wine. It shines like a quiet promise. Your neighbor prefers olive oil. Another tucks stale bread moistened with grape must. Your uncle trusted goat cheese rinds, which gathered more flies than beetles and more scolding than praise. A fringe trick from a traveling potter still makes you smile. Rub the inside with a stick blackened in yesterday's fire to leave a smoky scent that, he swore, confuses night crawlers. You work along the line where wall meets path, setting the pots at even steps, as if laying out a slow procession. Each receives its little gift brand, crumb, sweetness, and each is propped with a stone so a breeze may slide through and keep the shade honest. Clay breathes. You can feel it under your palm. When the sun stands higher, the pots will be only warm, never hot, hospitable rooms for the unwary. Beyond the wall, a neighbor calls for a bucket. The child brings one, half full of yesterday's wash water, and a single floating leaf. You borrow a palmful and flick droplets onto the dust behind two traps, a damp ribbon that will write a scent for soft-bellied travelers. Your thumb leaves a crescent in the earth that will be gone by noon. You lift a stone and wedge it beneath another pot to open the door a finger wider. An earwig sleek as oiled wood darts from light into shelter. You let it. Evening will make it bold. And then your work is simple. There is a hush that belongs to dusk, and you trust it the way you trust the rope that helps you ford the stream in spring. A plain fact keeps you company as you move. Clay here is cheap and everywhere. Broken vessels are as common as pebbles after rain. Historians agree that cracked pots did not retire. Shards marked rows, capped seedlings, and roofed cisterns against quick air. Nothing baked was wasted. It is a relief to belong to a craft that honors the tired usefulness of things. You stop to listen. A faint rasp rises from weeds at the ditch leaf hoppers skipping like thrown grit. You brush the stems with a reed, and the rasp moves outward, then stills. You set a pot near the sound and weight its back with a wedge of broken brick. The mouth watches the ditch like a small eye. A breeze slides down the wall. and carries lime and olive from the mason's yard. Some gardeners swear that darker clay traps more because it gathers warmth by evening. Others insist that pale clay promises safety because it looks like stone. Historians still argue whether color and heat matter at all, or whether chance alone explains the tally in a pot. You decide to let the insects judge, and you place one darkened pot and one bright at the same corner. By now, your hands are filmed with dust. The creases on your knuckles as gray as the wall. A lark lands above you, studies your work, and pecks once at a rim as if to test the soundness of your plan. Finding no seed, it lifts away on a thin thread of song. The sun climbs and your shadow tucks itself beneath your feet. Shade retreats from the path and gathers under your traps. You pace the border again, straightening a pot here, widening a gap there, brushing aside a leaf that might look like danger to a creature you hope to catch. You choose one as a test and lift it carefully. Inside, antennae uncoil like little springs. A pair of beetles crouch like seeds. An earwig waits with the patience of a key in a lock. You lower the roof and leave them to their cool. You pause at the smallest pot and whisper a word of encouragement, because speaking to tools is an old custom and costs nothing. In the afternoon, you will ignore them entirely. At dusk, you will return with a basin and a quiet heart, lifting each shelter the way you lift a lid from a sleeping child's cradle. Some evenings give a modest harvest, some a busy one. Once, in a year of fat figs and lean everything else, you gathered more earwigs than almonds and fed them to the chickens like a festival. You step away, and the line of pots becomes part of the border, small domes in a row like gentle hills. Your breath thins until it is almost not a thing at all. There is little hurry left in you, only arrangement and the promise of evening. The traps will wait. You will wait. The garden, as ever, moves at the speed of shade. You pause at the low wall and tilt your head, listening for it, the dry, faint rasp that travels farther than the eye can see. It comes again, almost lost in the drone of bees, thin, uneven, like a comb run along rough wood. That sound, once you've learned it, is hard to mistake. The first whispers of locusts somewhere beyond the fields. You lean against the wall, eyes narrowing toward the pale hills. The light wavers slightly above them, the air not yet hot but already holding a restless shimmer. Somewhere in that distance, small bodies leap from stem to stem, testing the season's bounty. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, the threat of locust swarms was as familiar to farmers as the coming of the dry season. The insects might pass harmlessly, grazing only at the edges, or they might descend in such numbers that sky and ground seem to change places. Your grandmother's voice still rings in your memory. They arrive like visitors and leave like thieves. She claimed you could smell them before you saw them, something dry and faintly bitter in the air, like straw left too long in the sun. You draw in a slow breath, half believing, half testing, but all you smell now is dust and the faint green of crushed weeds. You walk the path between the barley and the cucumbers, the stalks whispering against your legs. Your sandals make small sighs in the dirt. A sparrow flits low across your vision, lands, and begins pecking with urgent little jerks, already feasting on something you cannot see from here. On the far side of the garden, you meet Fadwa, who has stopped with her water jar mid-step. She points with her chin toward the western edge of the plain. You follow her gaze. There, almost invisible unless the light catches them just so, tiny specks drift upward and vanish, leaps of small bodies in the grass. Not yet a swarm, but a hint. A fringe belief whispers in the back of your mind. Some say that hanging strips of bright cloth in the fields confuses the locusts, making them turn aside. You've tried it once, red and blue scraps fluttering in the barley, but whether it worked or not, you never learned. The wind tore them away before the locusts came. You and Fadwa trade a few quiet words about readiness, whether to burn more olive twigs tonight, whether to set nets at the garden's edge. Historians still argue whether early measures like these had any true effect on a swarm's path, or if such efforts only made the gardeners feel less helpless. You know from your own years that sometimes action is a comfort, even when results are uncertain. The sound comes again, closer now, carried on a small breeze. You stand still, letting the air brush your face. Insects hum near your ears, their pitch changing as they circle and move away. A shadow passes overhead, a stork, long-legged and solitary, scanning for its own meal. You watch it glide silently toward the hills, following the same sound you hear. You kneel beside the cucumbers, parting the broad leaves to check for damage. A few holes here and there, but no fresh droppings, no sign of a night raid. Still, you mark the row with a small stone, a reminder to check again at dusk. The afternoon may bring change, and you prefer to be ready. Your shadow has shortened. The sun is nearly overhead. You rise, brushing dust from your knees, and take one last look toward the pale hills. The specks still leap, small as seeds, against the sky. They are far yet, but you have learned to listen longer than you can see. You cross the narrow path to the melon patch, where the leaves lie wide and flat like open hands. The sun is climbing higher, its light sharp enough to press shadows under every stem. Melon leaves do not like the full brunt of midday. Neither do the tender flowers that will become fruit, if given the chance. You kneel, gathering the folded linen covers from where they hang over the low fence posts. The cloth smells faintly of last year's dye bath madder and walnut husk mingled into a dull, earthy brown. It is coarse to the touch, its weave loose enough to breathe but tight enough to blur the sunlight into something gentler. Historians agree that in this time, gardeners used such coverings for many reasons: to shade tender plants, to keep off sudden hail, and to confuse insects that preferred the bright green of new growth. You start at the farthest row, drawing the cloth over the vines so it rests like a thin roof, weighted here and there with smooth stones. Beneath it, the air cools quickly, and the light turns soft and green. You can hear the faint scratch of small legs on the underside of the leaves, a beetle looking for a place to feed. The covering slows it, forces it to wander without finding what it wants. A fringed trick you once saw in a traveling merchant's garden crosses your mind. He stitched small charms into the corners of his cloths, tiny metal suns and moons, claiming they frightened pests into thinking the field was watched. You've never bothered, though you admit the glint of bronze in the wind was a pleasant sight. You pause to inspect a flower, its pale yellow petals trembling under the weight of a small bee. The bee shifts, dusting itself with pollen before lifting away toward the figs. You lower the cloth carefully so it brushes the flower without crushing it. Historians still argue whether covering plants for part of the day truly reduced pest damage, or whether it mainly protected against the harsher sun. You suspect it helps with both, though proof is hard to measure. The work is slow but steady. You move along the rows, bending, spreading, adjusting the stones. The breeze carries the scent of warm earth and crushed leaves. Insects hum above the covers, landing now and then, only to take off again when they find no easy path. A grasshopper leaps from one vine to another and finds itself under the cloth, confused by the shift in light. You stand for a moment to stretch your back, wiping sweat from your forehead with the edge of your sleeve. The cloth ripples slightly in the breeze, a moving sea of dull brown in the middle of green. Beyond it, the barley sways, and a white bird crosses low, its wings catching the sun. The last row finished, you gather the empty basket and step back to look over your work. The patch lies under its protective skin, quiet and dappled. You know you will remove the cloths by evening, letting the plants drink the cooler light of late day. But for now, they will rest under the shield, safe from the worst of both sun and swarm. You make your way toward the cabbage bed, where the round heads sit like tight fists among a ruffle of outer leaves. The soil here is dry on the surface, but still cool underneath, and you can see where a few beetles have left small crescent bites along the lower leaves. The cabbages are stubborn plants, but they draw pests as surely as a lamp draws moths. You carry a small basket from the hearth, still warm from the morning fire, filled with the soft gray ash left after burning fig branches and olive twigs. The ash smells faintly sweet, with a trace of smoke that clings to your skin as you run your fingers through it. You crouch and let a slow stream of it fall between the rows, sifting like pale sand into the cracks of the soil. Historians agree that gardeners in 5th century Syria often used hearth ash to protect their crops. The fine powder could dry the bodies of crawling insects or discourage them from crossing certain lines. It was a method as old as the hearth itself, one that required nothing more than yesterday's fire and a patient hand. You work methodically, pinching small clouds of ash and scattering them in loose rings around each cabbage. The outer leaves catch some of it, wearing a faint dusting like early frost. You take care not to let too much settle in the heart of the plant. A little protection is enough. As you move from plant to plant, a memory rises of your uncle, insisting that ash from olive wood worked better than any other, while your neighbors swore by ash from barley straw. Historians still argue whether the source of the ash mattered, or if the belief was simply the comfort of tradition. You notice a trail of ants weaving between two rows, their line interrupted by your fresh dusting. A few hesitate, tapping the ash with their antennae before turning away. A small satisfaction, quiet but solid, settles in your chest. A fringe trick you once tried comes to mind, mixing crushed lavender flowers into the ash before scattering it. The scent was strong, and you thought it might double the deterrent. It made the cabbages smell pleasant, at least, though whether it kept pests away or merely pleased you, you couldn't say. The sun has warmed your back enough that the skin between your shoulders prickles. You stand, brushing ash from your hands, and look over the bed. The pale rings at the base of each plant are barely visible from a distance, but you know they're there, quiet guardians waiting through the day. A breeze stirs, lifting a faint cloud from one of the rings and carrying it toward the ditch. You follow its drift with your eyes, watching it fade into the air like a slow sigh. The cabbages stand still, their leaves moving only when a bee passes too close. You shoulder the empty basket and walk on, leaving the bed in its new quiet armor. You pause by the southern wall, where the stones hold the warmth of yesterday. The cracks between them are dark with shadow, and in those narrow spaces the geckos live, small, quick-bodied creatures, with skin the color of dried figs. You settle on your heels, waiting. The first one emerges cautiously, its head moving in short, precise turns. The eyes are wide and unblinking, set in a face that seems half amused, half wary. It slides forward, its toes splaying against the stone. In the still air, you can hear the faint tick of its claws. It freezes, then lunges its mouth, snapping shut around a small fly. The wings vanish before you even see them in its jaws. Historians agree that geckos were common allies in gardens of 5th century Syria, though no one kept them in cages or called them tame. They came and went as they pleased, hunting the small insects that gardeners also fought. Some said they carried blessings. Others saw them as signs of damp places that needed watching. You watch another gecko, smaller, perhaps younger, dart from a lower crack to the wall's top edge. It pauses in the sun, its tail twitching, then drops suddenly to the ground in pursuit of a beetle. The beetle struggles, legs flailing in the dust, until it disappears into the gecko's mouth. A fringe belief whispers in your memory, placing a bowl of water near the wall to keep geckos close, under the idea that they would return each evening to drink. You tried it one summer, and while the water vanished each day, you never knew if it was the geckos who drank it or the heat that claimed it. You lean back against the wall, feeling the warmth seep into your shoulders. A third gecko emerges, this one bold enough to scurry up the leg of a nearby fig table where a basket of drying herbs sits. It pauses to snap at something invisible to you, then disappears into the shadow under the basket. Historians still argue whether these creatures made a real difference in controlling pests, or if their presence simply offered comfort to gardeners, a sign that nature's own hunters were at work alongside human hands. For you, the sight of them swift, sure, and untroubled makes the work feel less lonely. The sun is higher now, and the wall's warmth deepens. The geckos retreat one by one into their cracks, their movements silent, leaving only the soft hum of the air and the shifting scent of herbs in the breeze. You rise slowly, brushing dust from your knees, and take a last glance at the wall. Somewhere within it, the little hunters rest, bellies full for now. You step into the pomegranate grove, where the air feels slightly heavier and the shade more dappled. The trees are shorter than the lemons or olives, their trunks twisting into low, branching arms that bear clusters of red-tinged blossoms. Some petals have already fallen, resting like thin scraps of silk on the ground. You begin your slow count, moving from tree to tree. Each blossom is a small promise, but you know not all will become fruit. Some will dry and drop. Others will be eaten or withered before the seeds can swell. You note which flowers look strong, their petals tight around a sturdy base, and which ones sag or bear the small chew marks of moth larvae. Historians agree that pomegranates were a valued crop in 5th century Syria, prized for their juice, seeds, and medicinal uses. They also agree that moths were among the most common threats, laying eggs inside blossoms before the fruit could form. Gardeners had to be watchful, inspecting each cluster closely to see if it had already been claimed by unseen mouths. You lift a branch and find a tiny hole in the base of one flower barely visible, but enough to tell you it is lost. You pinch it gently and let it fall to the earth. Better gone now than to waste strength on a spoiled prize. A fringe trick you've heard from an older gardener drifts into your mind, sprinkling fine sand into the blossoms to discourage insects from laying eggs. You've never tried it yourself, though you wonder if the sand would harm the petals as much as it helped. The bees here work quietly, dipping in and out of the flowers, carrying away their faintly sweet scent. A small butterfly flits past, its wings patterned like cracked clay, and lands on a blossom you know will not last. It rests there for a moment, unbothered by your presence, then moves on. You keep counting 21 blossoms on this tree that might hold, 15 on the next, 11 on the smallest at the end of the row. You murmur the numbers to yourself, letting them settle in your memory. By the time you finish, you have a mental map of the grove's chances for the season. Historians still argue whether heavy pruning early in the season truly reduced pest damage to pomegranates or merely gave the gardener a clearer view of the flowers to inspect. You lean toward the latter. The pests seem to find their way no matter how open or crowded the branches stand. The light shifts as a breeze stirs the grove, scattering petals like small, slow snowflakes. You watch them drift, some catching on your sleeves, others settling onto the soil to join those already there. You leave them where they fall, knowing they will feed the earth in their own time. You turn toward the next part of the garden, carrying with you the quiet count of blossoms, a number that will change with each day, but for now, feels like a small ledger of hope. You walk out toward the barley plot, where the green stalks sway just enough to hide the figure standing among them. As you come closer, you see the scarecrow, your own work from 2 seasons ago, leaning slightly to one side, its tunic faded from blue to something closer to smoke gray. A wide-brimmed hat sits crooked on its head, casting a long shadow over the straw that bulges from its collar. You circle it once, checking the knots that hold the tunic sleeves to the wooden crossbar. The cloth is frayed, the weave loose, and a bird has pulled a few strands free to line its nest. You pull the tunic straight, tugging at the sleeves as if the scarecrow were an old friend whose shoulders you are squaring before a long walk. Historians agree that scarecrows, or their simplest versions, bundles of cloth and wood meant to mimic a standing figure, were common in Syrian fields in the 5th century. While they might have done little to frighten birds for long, they served another purpose, a signal to neighbors that the field was being watched, whether by human eyes or not. You lift the brim of the hat to check beneath it. A small spider has spun a neat web in the shade, its threads trembling in the breeze. You leave it be. Anything that catches flies is a quiet ally. The face you painted in ash 2 seasons ago has faded almost entirely, leaving only the faintest smudge where an eye used to be. A fringe belief surfaces, a habit some gardeners keep, changing the scarecrow's tunic during certain phases of the moon to confuse the pests. Whether it confuses the birds or simply pleases the gardener, you can't say. You've done it once or twice, more out of tradition than conviction. You step back, studying the figure against the pale sky. The wind lifts the tunic slightly, making the arms sway with slow, uncertain gestures. A crow lands on the far fence, tilts its head at the scarecrow, then at you, then takes flight again. Whether it feared the figure or your presence, you'll never know. Historians still argue whether scarecrows ever truly reduced crop damage, or if birds learned too quickly to ignore them. You suspect they work best when paired with the rustle of a gardener moving through the field, the sound of footsteps and voices among the rows. You adjust the hat once more, pressing it down firmly so it will hold against the wind, then pat the wooden shoulder, as though sealing the work with approval. The barley whispers around you, its head's heavy enough now to bend the stalk slightly. You turn to leave, letting the scarecrow stand guard, more a companion than a protector, under the steady light of the afternoon. You follow the narrow path that loops between the barley and the vegetable beds, where mint grows in a ragged border, patches of bright green tongues licking at the edges of the dust. The leaves press close to the ground in some places and lift in small spires in others, each stem crowded with a clean, eager scent. You slow your steps on purpose, It is part of the ritual to let your sandals bruise a few leaves, to let the fragrance rise and move with you, a cool ribbon through the warmer air. You pinch a sprig near the top and roll it between your fingers, oil beads at the tips, invisible but stern in its purpose. You bring the crushed leaves to your nose and breathe until the back of your throat feels a little cold. The day's heat will not be gentle, but the path can still be kind. Farther along, the mint thickens where the irrigation ditch once overflowed in spring. There, the stems are dark and glossy, and the leaves crowd each other like guests at a feast. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, mint was a common herb planted near paths and doorways, used in kitchen and cup, and valued as a household remedy for uneasy stomachs and stale air. The plant's fondness for damp edges and its generous habit of spreading made it a natural border for gardens that needed both scent and softness. You crouch and sweep your palm lightly over a cushion of leaves. The plants answer with a hiss of fragrance, and a small cloud of gnats that had gathered in the shade lift, hesitate, and move on. You smile at this small theater, an ordinary wall of smell turned into a gate. Whether it keeps the worst of the swarms away is never certain, but it makes the boundary feel intentional, and it keeps your steps unhurried. At a bend in the path, the mint yields to a patch of thyme, then returns, as if it dislikes sharing the corner. You kneel there and pull a few weeds from its edge-thin, pale things that learn to hide in the better company. The soil beneath is cool and crumbles like bread, darker where yesterday's water sank and rested. You press a few mint leaves into that dampness with your thumb, a habit you learned from your mother. Press the scent into the soil, she said, so it climbs back up at noon when you need it most. A fringe trick flickers across your thoughts, a tale from a traveling muleteer who swore by lining his sandals with fresh mint before a long road to keep his feet calm, and the insects uninterested. You tried it once on a day of orchard pruning. Your steps felt cool as if you had borrowed water, and the muleteer earned an extra cup of wine for the story. Whether it keeps pests away from the path or only away from your patience, you cannot say, but the memory pleases you. A bee wanders down to test a flower spike. Mint blooms are not grand little pale mouths clustered along a stem, but they carry quiet promises for small visitors. You watch the bee lower itself, dusting its legs with a soft mantle of pollen before lifting off. A beetle appears on the underside of a leaf, shiny as a black seed. You tip the stem so it loses its footing, and it drops with a neat, surprised plop into the dust. You stand and walk the full length of the mint border, dragging the hem of your sleeve just above the plants so the cloth gathers the fragrance. The sleeve will carry the cool with you for a little while, and when you raise your arm later to shade your eyes, you will breathe it again and remember this quiet stretch of path. Historians still argue whether aromatic borders like these truly reduced insect pressure or simply masked the signals that drew pests to tender leaves. Perhaps they did both. Or perhaps the human who walked the scented path believed more deeply in the work at hand, because the path itself agreed to help. You stop near the gate where the path narrows, and the mint grows tallest, fed by a drip from the cistern's lip. Here, the leaves are so dense you can part them like hair. You break 3 stems, twist them together, and tie the small braid with a strip of old string. You leave the braid to hang from a peg at the gatepost, a simple habit that pleases you. When the wind runs along the wall, it will thrum through the little bundle and loose a breath of green. Another bundle you tuck under your belt for later, one for the lemon grove, one for the shade near the fig table. You do not pretend charms do the work of hands, but the work of hands is easier when the air is friendly. The hound pads up the path, pauses at the mint, and sneezes once, offended by the boldness of the smell. He keeps to the bare earth instead, walking beside you like a moving shadow. You crouch again to thin a corner where the mint runs too far toward the cabbages. If you let it, it will own the path before the autumn rains. Pulling mint is a forgiving task. It fights softly, and even the stems you leave behind will root and return more politely. You shake soil from a clump and lay it aside for replanting at a gap near the orchard. Nothing useful should travel far without invitation, but nothing useful should be wasted either. In the dust at your feet, ant trails cross and recross in quick grammar. They skirt the thicker pillows of leaves, As if the scent draws a line they prefer not to argue with, you scatter a few crushed leaves along one trail that heads boldly toward the melon patch. The line wavers, tightens, then writes a new sentence toward the ditch. The change is small and might be nothing more than coincidence, but it pleases you to see the sentence revise itself. Overhead, the light sharpens and the shade under the wall pulls itself into a narrow sash. You finish by smoothing the border with your palm, like a potter's hand along a rim. A few tiny blossoms break away and scatter, pale flakes that disappear as soon as they touch the ground. The path is ready for the heavier hour of the day, defended by something you can neither see nor measure, only breathe. Before you leave, you take one stem and fold it into your palm, closing your fingers as if you were keeping a small bird quiet. When you open your hand, the scent leaps up again, as eager as it was at first. You rub it along the inside of your wrist and the curve behind your ear. The cool follows you as you step away, and for a while the hum of the garden seems to move around you instead of through you. You glance back once to see the border lying neat and dark, each leaf a little shield, each stem a slender banner. The mint will not stop a swarm that means to eat the world, but it will bless your going and returning, and today that is enough. You let the last breath of green settle in your chest and turn toward the ditches, where still water sometimes breeds troubles you prefer to greet before they grow. You follow the path down to the lowest edge of the garden, where the ground relaxes into a shallow runnel. The ditch holds a thin ribbon of water, bright where the sun nails it, and dark where reeds throw their narrow shade. A dragonfly trembles on a blade of grass, its glassy wings making a sound like paper, thinking of turning a page. You squat on your heels and let your eyes soften until the rush and glitter become pattern. Slow water, slower silt, quick life upon it. The first chore is always the same. You slide your reed rake from the wall, its teeth bound with twine that remembers other mornings. You lower it to the bed of the ditch and draw a careful line toward you. The water clouds instantly, brown rising like a memory. Pebbles tick against the rake and settle again. Hand by hand, you pull silt to the bank and heap it where the sun can find it. When it dries, you will carry it back to the melons, because nothing that passes through the garden should leave it for long. A frog hauls itself from under the bank, the color of wet bark, and regards you with patient gold eyes. You nod, as if meeting a neighbor on the road. It slides back into the dim and becomes a lump with a breath. Flies skate on the skin of the water. The frog considers and does what frogs do. Allies come in many sizes and ask little but quiet. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, irrigation depended on small channels cut by hand from springs, cisterns, or communal conduits. Their flow managed with shunted stones and simple boards. Silt needed lifting, banks needed padding, and gates needed persuasion. The grand works, great tunnels and long canals, fed the smaller veins. But it was the daily work at a ditch like this that kept a garden alive. You reach the first gate, two stones set close with a flat board between them. Water gathers there, ponders, and slides through in three thin tongues. You lift the board a finger's breadth and watch the change. The sound deepens, the tongues join. The light on the surface turns from sparkle to run. You set the board again with a wedge of olive wood, so the flow will not shift while you move along. Where the ditch widens in a lazy pocket, surface stillness has tempted a little slick of green. You break it with the end of the rake. The pieces crumple and drift, then gather again at a bend. A habit you recognize and forgive. At the pocket's edge, a small, stale smell hangs in the heat. You pull from your pouch a fold of old cloth and a tiny vial with 2 drops of olive oil. You let a shine walk across the stillest water. It spreads thin as breath, dimpling the skating insects until they lift in a sulk and leave. A fringe tidbit you learned from a caravan guard who swore a few drops could quiet a trough all night. You have found it useful when fed water must pause. Sharp sunlight bites your shoulders. You shift to the shade of a mulberry and run your palm along the bank to feel where it caves. A soft segment gives under your hand, the mark of a burrowing creature or an impatient foot. You press damp soil back into the wound and wedge it with flat stones, setting each as you would a tooth in a comb. The water, reassured, smooths its own worry lines and resumes. Farther on, the ditch narrows and the reeds thicken. You part them with the rake and the air cools, wet and fern-scented. Gnats lift in a sigh and settle again when they decide you are not weather. You pinch the reed stems where they lean too hard across the flow, cutting them with your knife into neat lengths for later ties for vine and pole. A spill of good green rope. You pause to drink from your skin and look back over the run you have cleaned. The surface is livelier, the banks less sullen. A small bird flicks down, tests the clear place, and lifts away with a drop bright on its beak. Your mouth tastes of leather and sun, then of the faint sweetness of the water itself. You pour a little for the earth. The earthen lip drinks it at once. You think of other hands. Your father teaching that a ditch left alone teaches you a lesson you will not soon forget. Your mother insisting a single stone smartly placed can move a morning's labor downstream. In the far village, an old woman tosses crushed rue into the still parts to make the water unfriendly to the things that wriggle there. She says the scent convinces them to move on. You tried it once and found the smell bossy but not unkind. At a bend where the ditch turns toward the barley, a shallow basin holds what the last flood forgot. You scoop with a clay bowl, ferrying the heavy water to the bank. The bottom shows a pattern of ripples someone drew with their finger and left for you to finish. You rake the last of the silt aside and feel the bed with your knuckles firm, not yet cracking. It will do. A dragonfly returns and writes the same silent sentence over the water that it wrote when you arrived. You let your breath match its glide. For a long minute, the only sound is the polite talk of water against stone. Historians still argue whether people of your time truly connected the bite of swampy evenings with the fevers that followed, or whether they trusted more in bad air and unlucky winds. You know only that still water grows trouble faster than running water, and so you keep it moving. You come to the outfall, a short step where the ditch hands its gift to the next field. The board here has split along the grain and leans like a tired shoulder. You replace it with one you stored under the wall last winter, set it firm, and seal its edges with a thumb of clay. Water acknowledges the change with a low, pleased note. You answer with a nod, because good manners belong between people and water as much as anywhere. Before you turn back, you gather what the ditch has offered, a handful of stones smooth enough to weigh nets, the reed lengths you cut, a pinch of damp silt for the pot with the struggling basil. You wash the rake in the running part so it dries clean, then lean it where the wall will shade it. Your hands smell of wet earth and reed sap. You rub a sprig of mint along your wrists to teach the scent to behave. The ditch runs now like a thought without interruption. The gnats thin over the quicker water. The frog keeps his counsel. The dragonfly patrols the same lazy court. A cloud loosens its hem and throws a cool hand over your neck. You let your shoulders drop and study the little gate once more. The wedge holds, the tongues keep their shape, the garden takes its portion and no more. On the walk back, your feet write damp prints in the dust where you splashed. They fade as you watch. The ditch, quiet and obedient, speaks behind you in a voice that has nothing but movement. You carry that sound with you, a soft thread to tie the rest of the day. You return from the ditch with your reed lengths under one arm, passing the small shed where the grain baskets are kept. The baskets sit on low wooden frames, raised just enough to keep them off the ground. Their woven bellies bulge gently, the pale strands of palm fiber smoothed and darkened with age. You step inside where the air smells of dry grain, faint smoke, and the clean dust that only comes from stored barley. Kneeling beside the first basket, you run your hand over the lid. The weave is tight, but along the edge you see the telltale powder left by beetlework, a dust finer than flour, clinging in the creases. You lift the lid carefully. Inside, the grain lies in a shallow dome, each kernel catching the narrow light that falls through the doorway. You take a pinch between your fingers and let it run back into the pile, listening for the faint hiss it makes as it falls. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, gardeners and farmers alike guarded their stored grain with vigilance, for insects could undo a season's work in weeks. One simple defense was to sift fine sand over the top layer, letting it settle between the grains to make the space unkind for crawling intruders. You reach for the clay pot you left by the wall, its mouth filled with clean, dry sand gathered from the higher hills. You scatter the sand slowly, letting it fall in an even sheet over the grain's surface. The pale grit dulls the shine of the barley, hiding it under a thin veil. You smooth it with your palm until the top is level, then replace the lid, fitting it snugly into the rim. The sand will shift downward with time, settling into the spaces where pests might have hidden. At the second basket, you find fewer signs of trouble, only a single beetle crawling near the edge. You pinch it gently between thumb and forefinger and drop it into a jar that will later be emptied far from the storehouse. A fringe trick comes to mind, something your cousin swears. By mixing crushed bay leaves into the sand to strengthen its bite. You tried it once. The scent was pleasant enough to you, but the grain kept the flavor for months, and some in the household didn't thank you for it. You work your way along the row of baskets, checking each in turn. Some need no sand at all, only a fresh tightening of the lids. One basket has a small gap in the weave, where a fiber broke. You press a folded reed length into the space, binding it with a strip of palm until you can repair it properly. Outside, the wind brushes the shed's roof, making the palm fronds whisper against each other. Historians still argue whether sand alone was enough to keep stores safe, or if its success relied on pairing it with other methods: cool storage, quick turnover, or even the watchful company of a cat. You keep a cat for the mice, though she prefers the sunlit wall to the cool dim of the shed. By the time you finish, the sand pot is half empty, and the baskets sit quiet, their bellies full and their surfaces neat. You dust your hands against each other, the grit falling to the floor in a small, clean rain. In the doorway, the light has shifted. It falls more directly now, catching the stray strands of the basket rims. You pause a moment, taking in the dry scent of the storehouse, a smell that is equal parts labor and patience, before stepping back into the brightness outside. You step out from the cool of the shed and squint toward the highlight. The garden takes a breath with you, and in that breath a shadow passes long and loose edge tilting across the lemon leaves, sliding over your shoulder and sailing away. You look up in time to see the first of them, starlings stitching a dark thread through the brightness, turning as one the way fish turn, then breaking apart into quick, hungry pieces. They come low over the barley and skim the fence, voices like needles clicking in a cloth. Each tilt of wing throws a new patch of shade over the beds, a thin film that lasts no longer than a blink. You stand still and let those small disappearances wash across your face. Under their path, gnats vanish. A beetle hesitates, then vanishes too, but for a different reason. A second band follows the first. Then swallows appear so certain of their work that they seem to measure the air with their tails. One takes a curve so tight that it seems to fold into itself. Then it snaps something from just above the melon cloth and writes a new line toward the ditch. Farther off, a lone hoopoe flares its crest and pecks with stately patience at the edge of the path. You nod to it as you pass. It ignores you in favor of a grub with poor judgment. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, birds were both thieves and guardian starlings, swallows, and other small hunters relieving gardens of gnats and larvae, while, in other seasons, helping themselves to figs and grain. People learned to read the sky as an extension of the soil, watching flight patterns like weather, listening to the change in sound when a flock shifted from travel to feeding. You lean your rake against the wall and drag a fallen branch to an open spot between the cabbages and the barley. You fix it upright with a wedge of stone and a twist of reed, a poor tree pretending to be a fine one. It is a simple perch, nothing more. But you have learned that swallows appreciate a place to pause and argue about strategy. The first to use it lands before you finish tying the last knot, shattering a sharp opinion about your method, then lifting again to show what it meant. Near the vineyard edge, thin cords run from post to post. They hum faintly when the wind remembers them. You test one with your finger and it answers with a soft voice. Last winter, a shepherd taught you to thread 3 reed whistles into the cord tiny cuts, near one end that let the breeze sing through them. A fringe tidbit, he said, that keeps flocks just unsettled enough to turn before they settle into theft. Whether chord songs spare a grape or only entertain the gardener is unclear, but the tune pleases you, and the birds seem to negotiate with it rather than ignore it. The starlings pass again, tighter now, the dark knot of them pulling a rip in the air and letting it heal behind them. A few settle in the olive for a short committee meeting, then drop in drips back into flight. You remember the year they discovered your barley 2 mornings before the harvest and removed the suspense for you in a single afternoon. The memory itches, then leaves. Today they are hunters, and you are glad for their rent-free labor. You bring your hands to your brow to shade your eyes and scan higher. Far off, a kite works the wide blue, slow as a priest at a slow ceremony. When it tilts, the field tilts with it. Some gardeners set tall poles to invite such hunters to rest, hoping their vigilance thins the locust scouts. Historians still argue whether these high guests truly reshape the math of a season, or only comfort human eyes that like centuries. You set poles anyway when you have a spare length and time enough to lift it. It costs little to welcome skill. At the corner by the fig table, you tie a strip of linen to a post, a pale tongue that will tell you about the wind. Another strip you knot from post to post over the lowest vines, not as a wall but as a muttered suggestion. A hoopoe hops beneath the line, pecks once, and extracts a pale curl from the soil. It beats the curl against the ground with the gravity of a judge, then swallows it and begins the next case. You think of another practice that travels by rumor, fastening a small sliver of bright metal to the crest of a scare branch, so that when it turns, it sheds light like water. Some say it frightens birds. Some say it calls them. You tried a coin once and spent a week watching a family of magpies court it. You retrieved the coin after they lost interest, put it back in your purse, and declared the experiment equal parts delightful and unhelpful. A plain fact keeps your hands steady, while your eyes keep the sky. When the birds are hunting, the air near the beds grows easier. Flies vanish. Leafhoppers quit their rasp, and even the green shieldbacks lose interest in parading across pathways that have become streets with too many guards. You turn slowly along the melon edge and find the quiet there you hoped the cloth would invite. The starlings pour once more over the barley, bend as if tripped by an unseen string, then smear into the distance. Their leaving is a feeling in the light more than a picture. The garden grows still enough that you hear your own breath. Relief is not a loud thing. It is a smaller hum under the ordinary hum, and it sits well in your bones. By the wall, a handful of children try their luck with slings. The stones go farther than their patience, then not as far. You show one how to fold the pouch and release with a softer wrist. The next stone kisses a patch of sky you can almost point to. He looks at his hand as if it had a new idea. The slings are not for birds today. They are for learning the shape of distance and for telling the crows you are not asleep. You walk the long line once more, checking the posts, listening to the reed whistles, eyeing the perch you set. A swallow returns to it and leaves again in a breath, proving that the perch does what a perch should. You lift your water skin and wet your thumb, drawing a small damp arc on the top of the post so the wood will remember the cool when the day is cruel. You tell yourself the gesture is for the birds. You know it is also for you. Some say birds carry messages about the day to come, that the low sweep of swallows means calm by sunset, that a nattering of starlings at noon tells of a restless evening. Historians still argue whether such readings were poetry disguised as practice or practice dressed like poetry. You enjoy the game either way. You pull the linen strip down, taste the wind on it without thinking, and hang it again. It tastes like dust and sun, which is to say, like today. When all your small arrangements stand as you wish, you sit on the wall and let your legs dangle into the shadow. A thin flight of swallows writes itself over you, and for a moment you imagine you are a low hill with weather to admire. The hoopoe crosses your path with its dignity intact. The garden returns to its slow speech water whispering, leaves agreeing, pots waiting. You rise when your back asks you to, and you leave the sky to its quiet, content to know that for this hour at least, it favors you. You whistle once, soft as a moth's wing, and the vineyard dog rises from the cool patch beneath the fig table. He is not young, not large, but he is certain of his borders. His ears lift, his tail writes a lazy greeting, and then he is already at work, nose low, reading the morning the way you read water, by what moves and what does not. You follow at an easy distance, letting his path decide yours. He starts where the lemon grove gives way to vines, at the gap in the wall that mice prefer. His nose pencils a line over the dust, pauses at a tuft of grass, and then he digs twice, not with excitement, but with the steady thrift of a creature who knows results come when they come. A faint crumble sighs from the bank. A beetle scurries out, offended, and the dog ignores it in favor of a smell you cannot name. He sneezes, shakes his head once, and snorts disdain at the hole before moving on. You have learned his grammar. A quick zig is vole. A deep inhale with one raised paw is lizard. A low growl, very small, is weasel visited at night and gone by dawn. Historians agree that vineyards in 5th century Syria were common along terrace slopes and in low fields where water could be guided. They also agree that dogs were routine companions in rural spaces kept for guarding, for company, and for the quiet authority their presence lent to a boundary. At the first row of vines, he stops, nose pressed to a post, then tracks the cord down to the soil. There, a tiny tunnel mouths at the base, its rim polished by small bodies coming and going. The dog taps it with a claw, listens with his whole head, and looks up at you. You kneel and collapse the entrance with 2 fingers, firming the soil and pressing in a sprig of mint from your belt. Whether it convinces anything to choose another route is uncertain, but it pleases you to leave a sentence there that says, "Not today." He patrols the underleaves, brushing his ribs against loose tendrils that catch in his fur and let go. You lift a broad leaf to check the shade, no fresh webbing, no new chew marks. Above you, a line of cord hums faintly. The dog picks up speed along the inner path, toes scattering thin ash, where yesterday you built small rings around lettuces. He stops to drink 2 mouthfuls from the shallow bowl you keep under the wall. His tongue makes the quick sound of a bird alighting and leaving again. A fringe tidbit returns from your grandfather's talk. He swore by brushing a dog's shed hair along the garden edges in spring to persuade foxes and smaller thieves that the ground was already spoken for. You have tried it in lean years, when scent felt like another tool. Whether it bars a hungry creature is difficult to prove, but the act of claiming the border with what your house already owns has its own comfort. The dog noses under the fig leaves, comes out dusted with pollen that makes his muzzle gilded in the slant of light. He sneezes, offended by beauty, and checks the cool shadow behind the storage jars. A gecko darts from his whiskers like a flung seed. He pretends not to notice, preserving the dignity of both hunter and harmless neighbor. At the far side of the vineyard, he stops short. His tail stiffens, not with alarm, but with math. You know this sum: 3 quick sniffs, a paw scrape, a low huff. He has found the bed of a night visitor rodent, or little weasel, curled against the warmth of a root. He circles it once, lays his chest on the ground to think closer to the problem, then rises and looks to you again. You pull a flat stone from the wall's foot and seat it over the shallow nest, then firm the edges with your hand as if sealing a lid. The dog approves with a sound you could call a cough if you needed a human word. You pass along the row where last year the locusts dipped their soft teeth into young leaves. The dog investigates the lower trellis, stopping where the vine meets pole. He lifts his head, tasting the air as if it were a cup. Far off, the hills keep their pale counsel. The rasp you heard earlier is gone for now, but you do not mistake silence for safety. Historians still argue how often small household dogs served as true pest managers in antiquity, or whether their work stayed mostly in the realm of alert and companionship on small plots, while larger estates favored traps and human watchmen. You have no estate. You have the dog. You find the debate tidy but unurgent. He pads toward the olive trunks and pauses by an amphora shard that roofs a small hollowish shelter you set for earwigs and beetles. He sniffs once, decides the room is occupied, and leaves it to its purpose. At the melon patch he slows, respectful of the covers, and chooses the narrow paths as if he had woven them himself. You praise him by saying nothing. He prefers the currency of unbroken routine. At the barley's edge, he gives 2 short barks rare coins he spends carefully. You follow and find a new burrow where the earth puffs slightly, like a breath held too long. The opening sits just inside the shadow of a stone. You remove the stone, collapse the entrance, and tamp the soil with the flat of your palm. From your pouch, you pull a twist of reed and press it across the place like a stitch, more for your memory than for any creature's education. The dog watches, then scuffs dirt over your work with his paw, making it his correction. You bow to the editor and move on. Birds return in a loose scatter, not hunting now but curious. A swallow drops low to study the dog's back, as though considering riding him to the ditch. He ignores the attention and inspects the compost heap. where a warm smell keeps odd company with the day. A pulse of flies lifts and settles. He snaps one from the air without thinking and looks mildly surprised at his own efficiency. High light flattens color to chalk. The world narrows to shape and sound. The dog clings softly where his collar holds a tiny bell, not to warn birds, but to tell you where he is when he wanders into vines thicker than your patience. Some neighbors say bells disturb wary pests. Others say they only lend music to wandering. You keep the bell because your ears rest easier when its small silver thread writes through the rows. He leads you up the short terrace where the soil is leaner and the vines grip harder. There, at a gap in the stonework, he faces the wall and exhales a single thoughtful breath. You set your shoulder to a loose rock and fit it back into place, then wedge two smaller ones beneath, copying the logic your father taught. Big stone listens to little stone. Little stone listens to earth. The dog stands by, a slow metronome of tail against vine, and accepts a scratch along his jaw for services rendered. On the way down, he steals a cool rest in the shadow of a water jar, chin on paws, eyes tracking the path you haven't walked yet. You sit beside him and share the shadow, your backs touching the same clay. The breeze arrives with the kitchen's noon roomer onions, a lick of cumin, a story that is really only hunger. The bell on his collar does not ring. He is practicing stillness as a craft. When you rise, he rises. He checks the pots along the wall as if they were children you asked him to count. He escorts you to the gate and stands there, not asking to pass, only confirming that the hinge knows both directions. You rub the place between his ears where the fur grows in a spiral, and he leans his whole head into your hand. The garden is a book he reads daily. You are a margin note he tolerates with affection. You send him back to the fig shade with a gesture. He goes at once. Patrol complete. Borders rewritten in scent and habit. The rows feel quieter for his walking, as if each vine has been reminded which way to face. You take the path toward the house to fetch the dusk lamps, already thinking of moths and the slow light that will summon them elsewhere. Behind you, the bell rings once, then rests, and the vineyard breathes as if it had been holding its breath for you to finish. By late afternoon, the light has the softness of fruit flesh, and the garden exhales. Heat loosens its grip on stones. Shadows stretch their limbs and remember how to be cool. You bring out a shallow basket lined with rags and set it on the fig table. Inside are the dusk tools: clay lamps, a bundle of flax wicks, a stoppered skin of olive oil, 2 iron hooks, and a coil of cord rubbed with beeswax so it behaves. You begin with the lamps, small, round-bellied, each with a pinched lip like a careful thought. You thumb the dust from their shoulders and feel the old heat they've memorized from other evenings. Historians agree that simple olive oil lamps were the common light of 5th-century Syrian households and gardens alike. A clay body, a little pool of oil, a wick of flax or tow, and patience. They were cheap to make, easy to mend, and steady in their manners if you treated them kindly. You fit a wick through the first lamp's mouth, leaving a shy tail at the lip. Oil moves like hesitation when you pour it. It likes to think before it travels. The wick darkens as it drinks. You set the lamp on the table's edge, then another beside it, until a row of small moons waits for evening. A gnat tests the first darkened wick, finds nothing worth telling, and leaves. At the fig trunks, you tie lengths of cord between low branches and the posts you set last winter. The cords sag a gentle arc. You like the way they make the air look thoughtful. You hang 2 lamps on one cord, one on the next, then 3 together where the fruit hangs densest and the moths gossip loudest after sundown. The iron hooks bite the clay lips with soft clicks. Each lamp swings a finger's breadth in the breath of the evening wind. You strike a taper from the cook fire and carry it like a slow comet. The first lamp answers with a bead of flame that grows into a small, attentive tongue. The second takes it at once, more eager than its sibling. By the time you reach the third cord, the olives are murmuring above you, the sound they make when they approve of the hour. Moths always come with dusk, as if they were written in the margin of the day. Light and sweet sap are their languages. Your plan is simple. Speak more brightly here than the figs speak over there, and let curiosity do the rest. You know it is not a perfect strategy. Smoke from a nearby lamp will singe a few. The flame will take others, and the circle of light will distract more than it destroys. Historians still argue whether light lures moths away from fruit in any lasting way, or merely gathers them where humans can feel they are acting. You argue only with your hands, and tonight they are busy. A fringed tidbit you picked up from a peddler returns to you. He swore that rubbing the lamp lips with a smear of quince resin made the flame smell faintly like blossom and drew moths more surely than plain oil. You tried it once and decided the only thing you truly attracted was your own hunger for quince. Still, you keep a pinch of resin wrapped with the wicks for evenings when you need to believe in extra inches. You rub the smallest lamp with a thumb of it now, smiling at your own softness for such additions. The lamps settle into their work. Light drapes itself over bark, collects in the bowls of leaves, and climbs the underside of branches. You step back and watch the scene steady, the way a scribe studies a page from arm's length to see if the lines make a quiet choir. A pale moth arrives, scribbles a soft errand in the air, chooses a flame, wobbles, retreats, returns drawn, undecided, drawn again. It circles until a swallow of heat folds it into a small, soundless ending. You do not delight in endings, only in diversion. So you hang a strip of coarse linen just behind one bright lamp, so that the light makes a truer field, more surface to admire and less flame to find. A second strip you wet and drape to one side. The moisture will hold a cool that the night visitors seem to test with their bellies before moving on. Whether this small theater truly helps is not certain, but the scene pleases you, and sometimes pleasure translates into patience, which translates into care, which is the gardener's true engine. A bat knits itself from the dark and sows a quick curve through the lampglow, its wings whispering like carefully folded letters. You nod to it and wish it good hunting. Somewhere at the garden's edge, a child counts the lamps aloud and decides the number means luck. You don't correct the arithmetic. You accept the blessing in whatever language brings it. You walk the fig row and check the fruit with the backs of your fingers. Warm, tender, some already sugaring at the eye. You brush away a small web built since noon and tuck the spider on a lower branch where it will do less harm and more good. A gecko, late to its watch, settles near the brightest lamp, inching forward with the cautious abundance of a creature that has perfected patience. It licks its own eye and becomes a statue with an appetite. At the far post, you wedge a flat shard of amphora behind a lamp so the light pushes forward like water in a channel. The shard throws back a pale echo. The trunk in front of it glows like a well-tempered ember. You learned this trick from a mason who used shards to paint light into dark corners of his yard. He called them poor mirrors, but you think of them as second sons. The oil sinks invisibly as the wicks do their quiet arithmetic. You touch each lamp once, just a kiss of finger to clay to feel whether the heat grows greedy. Where a flame smokes, you pinch the wick shorter. Where it gutters, you tease it longer with a sliver of reed. The gardener proves in the language of fewer wings, near figs, and more wings where the light makes a little festival. From the road beyond the wall, two neighbors pause and watch. One asks if you are turning your garden into a wedding. You answer that you are marrying moths to ambition. The line earns a laugh that carries nicely across the stones. Laughter is a good companion to lamps. It has the same habit of widening a circle. The sky deepens to an edible blue. You set two more lamps at the melon patch low, wide, and apart, so that anything tempted toward the cloth will find a different invitation. A breeze runs a finger along the cords, and the lamps make small answers in bright. The dog returns to check your work and lies down where the light warms his paws. He sighs as if the garden has bred him fine company. You think of other fuels. Fish oil, thick and insistent, burned hotter last year when you had it. The smell convinced even the bold to reconsider their routes. Moth and neighbor both. Olive oil is gentler, and you return to it whenever you can. You once added a splash of sour wine on someone's advice. The flame crackled, the smoke curled, and your eyes stung for a full hour. Experiments teach by asking you to remember quickly. By true dusk, the lamps have made a necklace out of the garden. Light hangs where fruit hangs, and the dark lives where fruit does not. You stand inside the circle and feel the difference in the air, the figs, breathing their sugar into the soft night. The moths writing wobbly script around the lamps. The predators drawing their own maps along the lines you've drawn. You relax into the slow success of arrangement. Historians still argue whether gardeners like you counted fewer worm-bored figs because of the lamps, or because of the season's wider mercies, cooler nights, a different wind, birds with better appetites. You place your thumb against a fig's seam and thank the lamps anyway. A practice that makes you attentive is already doing half its work. When the first stars show their clean bones, you open the oilskin and feed each lamp until the wicks shine steady and small. You will keep them until moonrise, then snuff most and leave 2 near the gate to convince the latecomers that there is a better party elsewhere. You lift the basket from the table, coil the spent cord, and breathe the mixed scents olive, clay, a curl of smoke, fig milk drying on your knuckles. The day loosens its hands. Night takes the tools and uses them gently. You wake early the next morning to the sound of a pestle on stone. In the cool half-light, you carry a small sack down to the corner where the limestone boulders lie stacked like sleeping animals. You've chipped these stones over the years from the same dry hillside, each piece soft enough to yield under a mallet. Today, you need dust fine as flour to scatter over the seedlings before the sun sharpens. You choose a rounded slab for your work table and lay a broad, flat stone on top. The mallet's first strike wakes a puff of pale powder that drifts sideways, catching in the damp of your sleeve. The sound is steady, stone kissing stone, a slow heartbeat. You rock the upper stone in a grinding arc until the larger pieces crumble into grit, and the grit melts into dust. Historians agree that gardeners in 5th century Syria often used powdered limestone or gypsum on their plants, both as a soil sweetener and as a light armor against soft-bodied pests. The dust dried small intruders, clogged their movement, and some claimed reflected enough sun to keep delicate leaves from tiring too quickly in the heat. You scrape the dust into a low clay bowl and work another batch. By the third round, your fingers are powdered to the nails, your forearms filmed in white. The air smells faintly chalky, dry but clean. A fringe method you once saw in a hill village involved mixing this dust with a thin slurry of ash, letting it dry again, then crumbling it to powder. The villagers swore the scent of ash kept moths from settling. You tried it once, the result clung stubbornly to your tunic for days, and the moths seemed only to adjust their schedule. When the bowl is full, you walk to the seedling bed where the first leaves of cucumbers and beans lift toward the soft light. Dew still beads their edges, trembling when you pass. You pinch the dust between your fingers and let it fall in a thin sift over each plant. It coats the leaves in a pale veil, settling into the damp like frost that will never melt. A beetle climbing a bean stem pauses, wipes its antennae against its forelegs, and retreats to the underside of a leaf. You move carefully between the rows, dusting the soil around each plant's base as well. The pale ring is a quiet moat, simple and patient. You hum to yourself without meaning to something your mother hummed when she worked the threshing floor, slow and almost shapeless. A grasshopper leaps from one seedling to another. Its legs kick up a cloud of your work before it disappears into the weeds. The sun peeks over the wall, sharpening every line in the dust you've laid. The pale leaves seem to glow faintly against the darker soil. Historians still argue whether these coatings worked mostly by irritating pests or by hiding the green from their searching eyes. You don't trouble yourself with the theory. You've seen the difference it makes in seasons when you remember to do it. You finish with the melon seedlings, brushing the excess dust from the cloth covers so it doesn't clump when the day warms. A swallow passes low overhead, chasing something too small for you to see. The shadow of its wings ripples over your pale dusted rows, and for a moment they look like ripples in shallow water. You carry the empty bowl back to the limestone stack, tapping its rim to free the last clinging powder. The air near the stones is cooler, as if they hold the memory of the night. You set the bowl down for tomorrow's batch. There will always be another row, another leaf, another hour. When a little dust stands between the garden and its hungriest visitors, you hear him before you see him, the soft clack of a frame against a pail, the small cough he uses to warn people that bees, not he, own the path. You follow the sound past the almond tree to the slope where the hives sit like squat clay soldiers, their mouths turned east to sip the first light. The beekeeper waits there, with his hat pushed back, his veil tucked at his neck, the look of a man who has negotiated all morning, with citizens who do not acknowledge borders. You greet him with a lift of your chin. He returns it with the same economy, then tips the frame so you can watch the slow choreography along its face amber cells. Pale caps, workers walking the tight streets with such purpose that you feel unqualified to speak loudly near them. The air wears that warm, complicated smell wax, flour, and a hint of smoke from the smoldering twist of rag in his brazier. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, beekeeping was as ordinary as bread, practiced in villages with clay hives, or woven skeps tucked into walls and terraces. Honey sweetened what wine could not, mended what vinegar wouldn't, and traded well when grain ran lean. Wax-sealed jars, lit nights, and paid debts that preferred a softer coin. You and the beekeeper have been trading rumors and favors for years, most of them measured in handfuls rather than weights. He sets the frame back with the tenderness of putting a child to bed. Your pomegranates? He asks without asking, already glancing down valley toward their red mouths. You describe your morning count. He nods as though reading numbers in the air. Bees take the gossip of blossoms seriously where the petals hold, where they disappoint, where a neighbor prays more than he waters. You talk about the safer flowers this week. He has his list. You have yours. The basil stands well. The thyme hums. The mint throws a clean party beside the path. The figs are moving from promise to confession. He warns you that the wild mustard near the road is set to shout, and that shouting will draw plenty to the margins. You make a note to check the ditch edge again. For standing water, the mustard will happily drink. He lifts the little smoker and gives it a polite breath. The rag glows and sends a thin ribbon over the hive mouths. The workers hesitate, loosen, and agree to ignore him for a minute. You remember how the first time he showed you this trick, you expected a dramatic retreat, little golden enemies fleeing like thieves from a lantern, and how instead they seem to consider the smoke the way you consider a tired joke, with patient acceptance. A fringe tidbit rises in the conversation, as it always does when the bees behave. The tale that a pinch of crushed anise sprinkled near the hive helps lost bees find their way home, as if the doorway could wear a perfume. He swears it worked one season when a neighbor's boy tripped and kicked a hive askew. You counter with the time you rubbed a gatepost with anise and were rewarded with a goat that could not stop licking it. The story ends as most of your fringe experiments do, with laughter and a vow to try again but differently. He opens a small earthen jar and shows you the color of this week's work. Not gold, not brown, but the in-between shade that remembers thyme and barley together. You dip a reed and taste. The honey is thick, faintly spicy, with a shy sour at the back of the tongue that promises to behave when married to warm bread. You trade him a plate of dried figs for the jar figs that learned patience under your lamps last year, and he pockets the trade with the gravity of a banker. You speak softly about pests as if they might overhear. He has seen more moths over the mulberries than is decent. You tell him the lamps drew a congregation last night, and that a bat signed the register. He grins, the grin of a man who believes in bats more than in plans. Historians still argue how much managed bees truly shaped yields in small gardens like yours, where wind and wild insects already wore paths through the blossoms. Some say the hives only ordered what would have happened anyway. Others credit them with turning a lean year fat. You have learned to thank the keeper and the bees and the weather in equal measure, and to blame none of the three when a season sulks. He squats to show you a patch of comb where the wax looks chewed, a sign that ants found a road and took their tax. He smears a narrow ring of clay at the hive's base and dusts it with ash, the same ash that rings your cabbages, so small invaders must reconsider. You make a mental copy of the pattern. The garden likes it when methods rhyme across species. A boy from his household arrives with a water skin and a question too long for patience. The keeper answers in 3 words and a nod toward the olive shade. The boy lopes off, practicing adulthood by pretending to be late for it. You watch the bees at the hive mouth sort themselves into arrivals and departures with a competence you would envy, if envy had time to stand here. He asks about the hills, whether you heard anything like a rasp yesterday. You tell him yes, a far whisper that refused to become a sentence. He nods, then glances at the sky with the expression of a sailor reading a fickle sea. Storks were high at noon, he says, and the swallows stitched low in the evening. The middle is never quiet for long. You agree without needing to agree. A little debate you have carried for years steps out to stretch its legs. Whether honey from certain weeks gives more heart to the plants when you mix a spoon of it into a weak brew for ailing seedlings. He claims he can taste recoveries in his cup of morning water mint, helped by mint honey. Basil by basil honey. You confess you tried honey water once on exhausted cucumbers and found only that ants believed in your science more than cucumbers did. The two of you let the debate sit down on a stone and nap. It will still be there at harvest. He lifts his veil to scratch his cheek and asks, in the way of men who do not pry, whether the late frost took your almond tips. You say only the impatient ones, which feels like a lesson for more than trees. He tells you a neighbor is planting basil thick along his cucumbers to confuse the moths. You brighten your border, also hums, and you exchange a look like two thieves pleased to find they stole the same idea. Historians agree that honey served as medicine, offering, and food, and that wax traveled as quietly as salt in pockets and pouches to mend the world's little leaks. They agree, too, that beekeepers mapped their villages by scent, as much as by path thyme here, fig there, a pocket of bitter almond beyond the wall. You witness that map now as a breeze shifts, carrying basil from your rose, then a quilt of smells from the road where someone has opened a jar of olives with fennel. The bees do not need the breeze announced. They have been reading all morning. Before he closes the last hive, the keeper presses a small wad of wax into your palm. For your lamp lips, he says. They will behave better after midnight. You thank him and imagine the wick's little temper softened by this gift. You offer him, in return, a handful of mint, crushed once in your fist to wake it. He tucks it into his hatband with a nod that makes his veil a green-scented curtain. You part the way you always do, with a half-promise to exchange news at week's end, and the understanding that bees keep their own calendar regardless of yours. As you walk back along the path, the hum follows you for a few paces, then stays behind like a song that prefers its own singer. At the garden gate you stop and taste the last smear of honey left on the reed. It reminds you that sweetness can be an argument the day sometimes wins. You pocket the wax, tighten your grip on the little jar, and step into the shade where your figs consider their evening. The swarms will come or they will not. The bees will work either way. Your hands have learned to move between such certainties and uncertainties without haste. You turn toward the low beds, where the cucumbers sprawl like sleepy cats, and the basil stands in neat ranks, green upon green, each plant chastely squared to its neighbor. The border begins, where the path narrows dark, glossy leaves near the ground, younger leaves paler above, and at the top, a scatter of tiny white flowers that look like quiet thoughts. You bend to the first plant and pinch the tip between finger and thumb. The stem yields with a small sigh. The cut end bleeds scent pepper, clove, a dark sweetness that climbs up your nose and sits behind your eyes. You walk the line, pinching each leader to thicken the plants, letting the fallen sprigs rain over the cucumber vines. The vines accept this with gratitude you can almost hear. The smell pools low, as if it were a cool liquid you had poured along the bed. A bee arrives to inspect the basil's pale mouths, then drifts to test a cucumber flower before wandering back, as if embarrassed by its own indecision. Historians agree that basil grew widely in 5th century Syria, valued for its sharp fragrance and for uses at table and in simple remedies. They note that household plots often reserved a full corner for it, cutting handfuls to throw into the pot, rub into oil, scent a room, or steep into a sip for unsettled stomachs. They also record the habit familiar across gardens of planting strong-smelling herbs at the edges of tender beds, not as ornament, but as working neighbors meant to displease small thieves. You press a line of basil leaves into the soil, thumbprints making a short necklace that will darken, dry, and crumble into the dust by midday. Between plants you tuck scraps of the stems you've pinched, the way your mother taught. Feed the path with what the path should say. The path answers by smelling like a kitchen door at noon. Gnats that had been conducting a meeting above the cucumbers falter and reschedule farther off. A fringe tidbit from your aunt returns to you, bright as it was when she whispered it while shelling peas. Set a basin of water among basil plants on the hottest days, and the air around it becomes soft as woven wool, drawing moths to drowse rather than eat. You have tried it, and seen the moths settle on the rim like coins, sluggish and foolish. Whether they slept or thought about sleeping, you cannot say. But the basil border felt content with the arrangement. The tall plants at the corner need trimming. You pinch off the spikes of small blossoms and lay them in a clay dish. Left on the stem, flowers mean seeds, and seeds mean the leaves become stern and bitter. You prefer the leaves to stay generous. A gecko watches from a crack in the wall, eyes round and reflective. When a fly tests the dish, the gecko ends the test and resumes his statue work, a satisfied guardian of your perfumed edge. You kneel to inspect the first row of cucumbers, lifting a leaf that holds last night's moisture in a single round drop. The drop trembles, magnifies a tiny arch of the vein beneath, then falls. No fresh chew marks, only an old scar healed cleanly. You lay the leaf down and brush a few basil petals from the soil. They cling to your fingers and insist on traveling with you. A memory walks in from your childhood. An old mason from the next village swore that basil kept scorpions shy. He sprinkled chopped leaves along thresholds each summer afternoon, then drew a line with the flat of his hand to say, "Here the house begins." You have never seen a scorpion obey a herb, but the threshold smelled brave, and sometimes bravery does half the work. From the road, a neighbor calls to ask if your basil holds its color better on the north side or the south. You answer that the north keeps its gloss in harsh weeks. The south fattens faster when the wind is kind. He nods as if you have confessed a secret, though the plants say the same to anyone who listens. Historians still argue whether the practice of planting aromatic borders truly changed a garden's fortune by confusing pests, or whether it simply changed the gardener's giving eyes something orderly to trust, and hands a fragrant task that made patience easier to keep. The sun tilts a little higher, and the basil begins to breathe more loudly into the heat. You gather the pinchings into a shallow basket tops for the stew. Leaves to pound with garlic into a paste you will soften with oil. One handful you bruise against the inside of your wrists. Another you rub over the wick or rim, so the basket carries the same argument as the bed. The dog wanders past, sneezes once, and chooses the far side of the path, where the smell is less persuasive. You pause to test a leaf the way your grandmother taught, folded in your mouth. Chew once, breathe out through your nose, listen to your tongue. The first taste is green thunder. The second is softer, rounder, like a promise kept without ceremony. You spit the leaf into your palm and bury it at the base of a plant. What feeds you, feed back, she used to say, tapping the soil as if closing a book. At the corner post, you tie 3 basil sprigs with a loop of reed and hang the little bundle so it dangles at eye height. Some say this discourages flies from using the post as an inn. Others say it is simply pretty. You accept both possibilities and add a 4th sprig, because the first 3 felt lonely. Beyond the post, the melon cloths lift and settle with the small breath of the garden. A pale moth bumps the edge and chooses to write its wobbly letter elsewhere, lured perhaps by yesterday's habit more than by today's hedge. You slide a hand under the basil leaves and feel the cool their shade holds close to the soil. A beetle, polished and sure of itself, pauses on a stem as if weighing the merits of courage. You nudge it with a reed tip. It drops with the insulted dignity of a small official dismissed from an office and disappears into a fold of earth where your ash ring waits to rearrange its plans. You plant a new row where last week's transplants left gaps. Each seedling comes from the shallow tray you keep near the fig table, thin, eager stalks with 2 round leaves like coins. You set them in the darker patches where last night's watering lingers, pressing the earth around each with 2 fingers, then pinching the top so the plant answers by thickening itself. Roots want an argument worth joining. Pinch talk is how you begin the discussion. A breeze fusses the leaves into glittering and brings the scent up against your face. You breathe through it slowly until it becomes part of breath, rather than something carried by breath. The cucumbers seem to recline more comfortably with the border standing alert beside them, as if they can afford laziness, because someone in the house has decided to stand near the door with their sleeves rolled. You think of the old superstition that basil sprouts best when sown with a mild curse to wake it, a scolding to teach it urgency. You tried it one spring out of curiosity and harvested a bed that looked normal in every respect, except perhaps for a certain readiness to grow where it was not asked. Whether words bind roots is a debate you leave to people with spare hours. Your hours prefer hands. A cloud passes, lowers the color, and makes the basil look darker and more secret. When the sun returns, every leaf brightens at the edges like a coin turned up in dust. You pull a few weeds that tried to masquerade as invited guests, their stems limp with the lie. The pile of pinchings in your basket shows the morning's gentlest mathematics, tiny top knots of leaves stacking into a small green hill. Historians agree that basil joined prayers and tables alike, used in courtyard rituals and in broths for the feverish, rubbed on bites and on door latches, sometimes tucked behind the ear on market days to sweeten the head. They catalog its many names and argue still which exact variety held sway, in which valley basil of the larger leaf or basil of the finer, whether the sharpness you taste belonged to this strain or that. Such arguments belong to scholars who collect words. Your leaves do not ask for a name before they work. When the border stands trimmed and close, you step back to study the bed. The cucumbers drowse under their saucer leaves. The basil holds a low green fence that says no with good manners. You scatter one last handful of torn leaves along the inner edge and rub your dusty palms together, releasing a final breath of scent that the air catches and keeps for a minute. Before you leave, you tuck 3 sprigs into your belt to carry the border's voice with you, a small sharp choir at your hip. You will bruise them again at noon and again at dusk, and on your pillow you will find a leaf that rode unnoticed until night. You do not mind. The garden likes to travel where you sleep. You walk the path away from the cucumbers, and the smell follows politely for a few steps, then stays to mind its work. The basil keeps its post, the vines keep their ease. The day goes on feeling guarded but not stern, watched but not scolded, and you too feel held by the border you built from cuttings, patience, and a habit of pinching the world into better shape. You leave the basil border behind and walk toward the olive grove, where the trunks lean in slow conversation with the wind. Their bark is a script you have been reading for years, deep furrows, pale scars, patches where lichen writes in its own language. At the 3rd tree on the left, you set your basket down. This one has been restless since spring, the bark flaking in wide strips that give pests too many invitations. You run your fingertips over the surface, feeling where the bark is firm and where it lifts like loose roof tiles. Insects favor those lifted edges, laying eggs in the narrow dark. You take a flat-bladed knife from your belt and begin scraping gently, not to wound the tree, only to send the dead wood back to the earth. Each strip falls with a dry whisper onto the soil, where ants quickly inspect the offering. Historians agree that gardeners and orchard keepers in 5th century Syria often scraped away loose bark from olive and fig trees to expose hidden pests and discourage borers. This was done slowly, sometimes in late winter, sometimes after a flush of insects in summer, whenever signs said it was worth the trouble. The exposed wood, pale against the older bark, was a sign of care more than decoration. You find a small clutch of beetle eggs, soft, pearly dots tucked into a crevice. You scrape them into a clay cup with a pinch of loose bark, then seal the cup with a twist of cloth. They will be burned later, folded into the same fire that dries your fig twigs for lamp fuel. You keep working until the trunk shows a cleaner face to the sun. A fringe trick you once tried, taught by a traveling tanner, comes to mind. Rubbing the scraped areas with a thin paste of vinegar and ash to make them unwelcoming to insects. You used it for one season. The paste clung in the rain, but the smell convinced a passing goat to taste the bark, undoing the work in a single afternoon. Now you let the sun and air do the curing. You circle the tree, pausing to listen for any sound of burrowing under the bark. Your grandfather swore you could hear it if you pressed your ear against the trunk at night, a faint clicking like tiny scissors. Historians still argue whether such sounds are real or imagined, whether the human ear can detect the slow hunger of a hidden insect. You've listened many times, but whether you heard the pest or your own pulse, you can't say. The next olive over has a branch low enough for you to brace a foot against the trunk and climb. From there, you can see into a fork where sap once bled from a wound. The scar is healed now, but you scrape the surrounding bark anyway, finding 2 beetles sunning themselves in the shallow shelter. They drop into your cup without complaint. From above, the grove looks like a scatter of dark green islands in pale earth. You can see the lemon grove beyond, the basil border, the cloth-covered melon patch, The site is both map and memory, the way you've kept these lines, shifted those edges, learned which corners invite trouble and which guard themselves. You climb down, pressing the loose bark into the soil with your sandal. The tree smells sharper now, as if the air on its skin has woken something old. You move to the next trunk, and the next, working in an easy rhythm. Scrape, cup, press, step. The basket at your feet fills with strips and curls, their colors ranging from silver gray to warm brown. By the time you finish the row, the sun is leaning west, and the olive leaves catch the light on their pale undersides, flashing like small mirrors. The scraped trunks stand lighter, each one wearing its maintenance openly. You pick up the basket, heavier now, and feel the satisfaction of a task that leaves the place quieter than it was. As you walk back toward the center of the garden, a breeze lifts a strip of bark from the top of the pile and spins it away across the path. You let it go. Some things are meant to return to the dust on their own terms. By the time you reach the fig table, the light has begun to cool, and the garden is sliding toward its softer hour. You set the basket of scraped bark near the shed, and pick up a small stool, and your dusk jar, a wide-bellied clay pot with a narrow mouth. Tonight, you will keep watch after sunset, waiting for the visitors who prefer to work when the rest of the garden sleeps. You choose the almond tree's shade as your post. From here, you can see the melon patch, the cabbages, and the basil border without moving much. You set the stool on firm ground, rest the jar at your feet, and settle in. The air is already different, lighter on the skin, carrying the mingled scents of mint, dust, and the faint sweetness of figs beginning to ripen. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, night watch in gardens was not only for guarding against human thieves. Many pests fed at dusk and through the night. Moths seeking blossoms, beetles chewing leaves, rodents testing the soil around seedlings. Gardeners learned to sit still and listen for the faint disruptions, leaf tremors, the dry snap of a stem, the tiny clicks of beetle jaws that betrayed activity. You let your breathing slow until it matches the soft rustle of leaves. A gecko appears on the low wall, its movements jerky but certain. Pausing to taste the air with its tongue, it slides down the wall and disappears into the melon patch. Somewhere near the cabbages, a faint tap-tap begins, a beetle knocking against a leaf's edge. You rise without hurry, cross the path, and pinch it gently between finger and thumb, dropping it into the dusk jar. You return to the stool, moving as quietly as water. A fringe trick comes to mind, sprinkling a thin line of crushed basil leaves near the legs of your stool to deter crawling pests from climbing. You tried it one summer. It kept your ankles free of ants, though you wondered if they avoided you because of the scent or because they were simply occupied elsewhere. The garden's sounds change as the light fades. Birds quiet themselves, their final calls brief and spaced apart. The hum of bees is replaced by the higher, thinner whine of small night flyers. Moths appear, their wings ghost pale, fluttering in hesitant arcs toward the lamps you lit near the figs. One brushes past your cheek, as soft as breath, and turns away. You lean forward, elbows on knees, listening. In the barley beyond the wall, something stirs, a quick ripple, then stillness. Perhaps a lizard, perhaps a vole. You make a note to check the fence there tomorrow. Closer by, a cabbage leaf twitches twice. You slip from the stool and crouch, lifting the leaf just enough to see the small, green-bodied caterpillar arched along its vein. Into the jar it goes, joining the beetle in its clay cell. Historians still argue whether the act of night watching significantly reduced pest damage or simply made the gardener more attuned to changes in the plot. You believe it does both. A garden kept under the eye, even a quiet one, seems to hold itself differently, as if aware it is not alone in the dark. You stay until the moon begins to lift over the grove, silvering the paths. Your jar holds a modest collection, nothing dramatic, just enough to know your patience had purpose. You will take it to the far corner and empty it onto the embers there, letting the pest's small heat join the fires. Before you leave your post, you sit a moment longer, breathing the cool air, listening to the slow, even movements of the night. The swarms may come, but tonight, you've kept the smallest ones from thinking the garden is theirs. That is enough for now. At first light, the chickens are already awake, scratching half-hearted circles into the dust beside the fence. They cluck in low conversation, a chorus of throats still heavy from sleep. You unlatch the pen, and they spill into the garden, with the slow urgency of creatures who know breakfast always arrives, but see no reason to delay finding it. You've prepared their dust bath, a shallow hollow raked into the dry soil near the olive trunks. The earth there is loose and fine from yesterday's work, and you've mixed in a pan of sifted ash from the hearth. The ash clings lightly to your fingers as you scatter it, darkening the pale dust to a soft gray. The mix will work into their feathers as they bathe, loosening dirt, drying mites, and discouraging other unwelcome riders. The first hen steps into the hollow, crouches low, and begins the ritual. A sharp kick of her legs sends the dust up in a slow cloud, settling over her back like invisible rain. She shakes, kicks again, and wriggles deep enough that only the bright beads of her eyes show above the soil. The others join, the air around them filling with the dry whisper of wings against earth. Historians agree that poultry were as much tools as livestock in 5th century Syria. Their scratching and dusting not only feeding themselves, but clearing pests from soil and plants. The dust baths, whether in ash, fine sand, or dry earth, kept the birds cleaner and the garden quieter. It was a small trade, space and shelter for the labor of beaks and claws. You sit on the low wall, watching them work. With each kick and shake, small beetles and larvae that had hidden in the soil tumble free. The hens seize them with swift, businesslike jabs, swallowing without ceremony. You remember your father saying that a well-fed chicken is a fine watchman for the cabbage bed, better than a scarecrow, for it never grows bored. A fringe trick from your neighbor comes to mind, adding a handful of dried rosemary to the dust bath to make the feathers smell pleasant and, he swears, more distasteful to lice. You tried it last summer. Whether the pests noticed, you can't say, but the garden smelled faintly of pine for 2 days, which was no harm. 2 hens break away to wander under the fig trees, pecking at drop petals and whatever moves beneath them. The rooster lingers near the bath, scratching half-heartedly before deciding his role is more supervisory. You toss him a beetle from last night's watch jar. He swallows it without thanks. You notice one hen has wandered toward the melon patch, testing the cloth covers with her beak. You call her back with a cluck that mimics their own. She hesitates, then returns, more from habit than obedience. Chickens, like pests, understand boundaries best when they're enforced daily. Historians still argue whether allowing chickens to roam in the garden caused more harm than good. They ate insects, yes, but they also pecked at seedlings and scratched too close to roots. You manage the risk by giving them this early hour before the day's work begins, then penning them again before curiosity turns destructive. The dust bath slowly empties of participants. Each bird leaves coated in a pale bloom of ash and soil, pausing to shake out the excess before strutting off. The hollow they leave behind looks like a small crater. The ash work deep into the earth, where it will do quiet work against crawling pests. You gather the hens with a trail of grain back toward the pen. The rooster follows, reluctant only in appearance. Once they are inside, the garden feels momentarily still, the air lighter without the constant soft churn of wings and claws. You look at the dust hollow, now shaded by the olive leaves, and think it will serve again in 2 days' time. You move next toward the far wall, where the gourds are trained on trellises made from olive prunings and lengths of reed. Their pale green skins hang heavy in the morning light, some long and curved like sleeping snakes, others round and smooth as river stones. The trellises creak faintly as you touch them, their joints tied with old strips of flax that have faded to the color of dry grass. Here, the pest of the week is the vine borer, a worm that tunnels into the stems, softening them from the inside. You kneel to inspect the thick bases where they meet the soil. Each vine wears a collar you made from folded palm leaves, tied loosely enough to let the stem breathe, but snug enough to confuse the moth that looks for a place to lay its eggs. Historians agree that simple barriers were a common defense in 5th century Syria's garden. Strips of reed, folds of leaves, or even small clay sleeves could be placed around stems to block crawling or egg-laying pests. They were not foolproof, but they bought time, which was often enough. You lift a palm collar to check underneath, brushing away a little soil with the side of your hand. The stem is clean here, no sawdust like frass, no pale scar where a larva chewed its way in. You replace the collar and adjust it to fit more snugly. The next vine is not so lucky. You find a small hole, edges darkened, the inside soft. With a sharp twig, you probe gently, catching a pale worm and drawing it out. It writhes in the light before you flick it into the ash ring at the base of the trellis. A fringe trick your uncle used comes to mind, sealing damaged stems with a paste of clay and vinegar after removing the pest. He swore the mixture hardened into a protective shell and discouraged further attack. You've tried it, and while the clay sometimes cracked in the heat, the smell alone seemed enough to keep new visitors away for a few days. You continue along the row, collar by collar, adjusting, replacing, removing the occasional intruder. The gourd's leaves are large and rough, brushing against your arms as you work, leaving faint scratches that feel like polite protests. A bee blunders into your hair and escapes, trailing a thread of pollen that settles briefly on your cheek before the breeze lifts it. Historians still argue whether these physical barriers were more effective than simply planting extra vines to account for losses. You prefer the former, less waste, more direct care. The act of checking each collar is also a chance to notice other changes. A new tendril curling toward the sun, a leaf dulled by thirst, a blossom half-eaten by a night visitor. By the time you reach the end of the trellis, your basket holds a small collection of wriggling offenders and a few collars too frayed to reuse. You carry them to the compost pit, tipping the worms into the ash where they will be smoked by dusk. The worn collars you set aside to dry. They will crumble into mulch for the cucumbers in another week. The gourds sway slightly in the morning wind, their skins still cool from the night. You touch one as you pass a long, heavy one nearly ready for harvest. Its surface is firm, unmarked by pests. The skin smooth except for the faint lines left by its slow growth against the trellis. You leave it hanging, a quiet reward for today's work. The sun is higher now, but a thin haze softens its edge. You cross to the herb slope behind the well, where the thyme grows low and dense, stitched into the soil like a thick mat. Between the thyme patches, narrow veins of bare ground wind downward toward the stone path. This slope is both kitchen and shield its sharp scent, a wall against crawling pests that dislike its taste or its feel beneath their feet. You kneel and run your hand across the tops of the plants. The leaves are tiny, rough on the fingertips, releasing scent only when crushed. A slow press with your palm sends a breath of green and resin into the air. You work methodically, pinching back the runners that have crept too far downhill and tucking the cut sprigs into your basket. These will dry in the storeroom's dim corner until they are brittle enough to crumble into stew or steep into water for washing. Historians agree that thyme in 5th century Syria served both the cook and the healer. It was known for flavoring stews and meats, for scenting stored oil, and for steeping in infusions thought to steady the breath and soothe the stomach. In gardens, its low, wiry growth made it useful between beds and along borders, discouraging small intruders. At the top of the slope, you check the line of flat stones that keep the soil from slipping. Between two stones, you find a small nest of black ants, busy ferrying pale eggs toward a crack in the wall. You break off a clump of thyme and press it gently over their path. The ants hesitate, milling in confusion before turning away. A fringe trick your neighbor swears by involves mixing crushed thyme with ash to scatter along an ant trail. You've done it yourself and seen the line vanish within the hour, though whether from the scent or from simple disruption, you cannot be sure. A sudden flicker draws your eye, a lizard darting between thyme tufts, chasing something invisible to you. It stops, lifts its head, and then vanishes into the shadows under the stones. You wonder if it prefers this slope because the thyme hides its scent from larger hunters. Historians still argue whether planting such dense, aromatic ground covers truly changes the number of pests in a garden or simply shifts them to other corners. You crawl a little farther, pulling the occasional weed that has dared to root between thyme stems. Each weed comes up with a small puff of earth, the roots pale and delicate. You tuck them into your basket as well. Later they will go to the chickens, who are less particular about flavor. The work here is quiet, no swarms to scatter, no urgent rescues, only the slow grooming of a living carpet, trimming it to keep it strong, and leaving behind the scent of your passing. The breeze carries that scent up toward the house, mingling with the olive leaves and the basil border, until the whole garden smells as if it had just been brushed clean. When the slope looks even and the stones are clear, you stand, brushing dust from your knees. The thyme lies close to the soil again, its tops clipped but already stretching toward the sun. You carry your basket down the slope, each step loosening a faint aroma from the sprigs inside. At the bottom, you pause to look back. The thyme seems to hum in the light, a low, steady presence guarding the path without show. You know it will hold its post until the next trimming, patient in its work. Midday arrives not with a shout but with a slow hand, pressing gently on the back of your neck. The garden narrows to essentials: shade, water, and patience. You cross to the almond tree, the one that keeps its leaves finer and thinner than the fig, that makes a silvery lace of light on the ground. The earth beneath it is cool where last night's watering wandered and then forgot to leave. You settle with your back against the trunk, knees up, forearms resting on them, and let your breath learn the garden's shorter rhythm. Heat stills large arguments and leaves only small ones. A beetle that would have marched at dawn now picks its steps as if each choice required counsel. Leaves that wanted to talk all morning fold their tongues and listen. Even your own thoughts go quiet, except for a simple count shade. Breeze, sip, stillness. You take a drink from the clay skin and feel the water arrive first, as a cool story in your mouth, then as a thought that slides down and makes the rest of you easier. The clay itself helps. Historians agree that water kept in unglazed pottery stays cooler because the jar drinks a little through its skin and gives it back as a whisper of vapor. The air steals heat from the water to pay for that gift. Your skin carries the same trick where a damp cloth lies across your shoulder. You wet it again from the skin, fold it, and press it to the tender place at the base of your neck. The cloth says thank you by remembering the well for you. Noon is not a time for the broad gestures of defense. It is a time for listening with the sides of your ears. You listen to the crackle of a single dry blade at the path's edge, and to the way silence rearranges itself after a fly chooses a new seat. You run your thumb along the dust beside your heel and raise a faint line, then smooth it again because lines suggest plans, and noon asks you to suspend plans like a pot over a low fire. From the almond shade, you can track the corners that need watching without moving more than a hand. The melon cloths lie still, their edges lifting a finger's width when a hot breath tells them a rumor, and then letting it go. The basil border seems darker under this light. It's green, a kind of hush. Farther off, the cabbages carry their ash as if it were a pale blessing. In the olive grove, 2 lamps left from last night hang empty, small moons taking a nap. A fringe tidbit from a caravaner drifts through your memory. At the fiercest hour, he said, set your knife upright in the earth near tender plants to cut the heat and make a passage for cooler air. You tried it once for the comedy of it, and found only that the knife was too hot to touch by evening. Still, the little steel sentinel pleased you in its absurd duty, and you left it there until the next cloud. You scratched the almond bark lightly with a thumbnail. The tree answers with a faint, sweet smell that only the hot hours unlock. Above you, a cicada starts and stops, testing the afternoon like a musician tuning for a concert the heat refuses to allow. Historians still argue whether midday quiet truly lowers pest feeding, or whether it merely hides it, whether insects pause, or simply move their hunger a hand's breadth deeper into shade. Your eyes say there is less to chase at noon. Your basket of mornings says the hours that matter are earlier and later. You let the debate dissolve into the glare and store only the practice. Sit now, move later. In the next patch of shade, a lizard performs a slow push-up, not for strength, but, you suspect, to lift its belly from the cooking dust. You copy it, easing your back from the trunk for a breath, then settle again. Shade is not just darkness. It is a shape you learn with your body how to fold it around your knees, how to offer it to your feet, how to trade it from shoulder to shoulder when the sun leans. You open your palm and let a pinch of thyme crumble there. The scent lifts and then seems to sink, like cool water poured on warm clay. Some households place damp cloths over baskets of fruit at noon and set them where air passes, an old trick to coax a draft through the weave and keep figs and cucumbers from sighing themselves to sleep too early. Historians agree that such small evaporative mercies lived in kitchens and courtyards long before anyone explained them. Your kitchen is the shade of a tree. Your courtyard is everywhere your sandals have consented to rest. A single locust, late or lost, clacks past the almond leaves and throws a brief counterfeit of shade on your forearm. It lands, thinks better of it, and smears away like a thumb across a soft line. You watch the air where it was, waiting for the echo. None comes. You return to your small couch shade. Breeze, sip, stillness. On the wall, a clay shard warms to the color of bread crust. You set it upright to lend a hand to a pocket of shade that needs a firmer edge. Another shard you lay flat over a shallow, damp spot, so the moisture will last until the hour when cucumbers begin to tire. These are noon's repairs, little re-angles, tidying gestures that ask almost nothing of muscle and keep the late hours from spending themselves too quickly. A superstition nods from childhood. Your aunt swore that if you hang a sprig of rue on a nail at the highest, brightest moment, the evil eye of the heat will blink and miss your garden for an afternoon. You have no rue today, and you are fond of the sun when it behaves, so the nail keeps its dignity without ornament. Still, you look upward and blink once, as if the sun might enjoy the exchange. The field beyond the wall goes bright enough to lose detail. All that remains are motions. A swallow writes a brief, illegible word above the basil and leaves the page blank again. A hoopoe crosses the path with courtly steps, as if the ground were a hall and it had an invitation. The dog, having learned the grammar of noon, lies on the north side of a jar where the clay writes cool and careful cursive along the floor. You wet the cloth again, this time wringing it so the drops fall onto the dust at your feet, and jump as if surprised to be water in so much light. The damp darkens a patch the size of your palm. In 2 minutes, it will be only a memory. For those 2 minutes, it is a private pool for the air to drink. You lean into its brief charity and feel your own edges come back into better focus. You consider the tasks that belong to the next hour, lifting the melon cloths a few fingers to invite the first post-noon breeze, checking the olive scrapes for loosened shavings, counting shadows in the pomegranate grove, where morning's blossoms became noon's quiet beads. Noon is not for doing those things, only for rehearsing them gently, making a list without writing it, letting your body remember the path between each task, so that when you stand, you will be walking before you know you meant to. Historians agree that households across Syria use the middle hours to step indoors, to nap, to mend nets or clothing in the shade, to grind spices where the air was least argumentative. You do your mending in the garden when you can knots in a cord, a new tie on a trellis, a lamp wick that wants a slimmer waist. Your hands move without noise, and the garden accepts the motion as not quite work, more like conversation. A slip of cloud passes over the sun, and the world sighs as one thing. Leaves brighten, then dim, then brighten again as the cloud decides it has finished speaking. Your own breath follows suit, shorter, then longer, and your shoulders forget they ever held your ears for company. When you finally stand, the ground feels a shade less committed to fire. You press your palms to the almond's bark in thanks. The tree has shared its cool grammar with you, and you will try to write with it for the rest of the afternoon. You step from the shadow into the narrow light and feel the difference like a change in sentence. Noon has done its work. You have done yours by not arguing. The garden resumes its slower talk, and you resume your pace among the rows, careful not to decide too loudly. Toward late afternoon, you take the narrow path that slips between the almond and the olives and bends behind the shed. There, where the wall meets the rock, sits the small place you keep for asking quietly a shallow niche, a shelf of stone, a soot print above it from years of lamps. A flat shard serves as altar. A smooth pebble marks the spot where your thumb always rests. The air here is cooler and still, as if the wind understands that loudness has no work to do in this corner. You set down your basket and lay a sprig of thyme upon the stone. Its small leaves shine like tiny coins. The scent lifts and folds back, a green wave that breaks without sound. You add a short length of clean reed, useful later, and pleasing now in its straightness, and a pinch of salt. You brought in a twist of cloth. Salt falls with the softest grit, a little snow on warm stone. From your belt pouch, you take a clay lamp, the one with a lip repaired long ago with a smear of wax. You tilt the oilskin, let 3 drops think their way into the belly, then tease a wick forward with a reed sliver. When you touch the flame to it, the wick accepts without argument, and a round of light forms against the stone, steady and modest. The lamp's breath smells of olives and last night's patience. Historians agree that households in 5th century Syria kept small places for devotion niches and walls, little shelves in courtyards, Stones set under trees where lamps burned, incense curled, and short prayers were folded into the day. Some bore crosses scratched in haste. Others carried older signs, and many simply collected soot that testified to a habit of light. Gardens had their share of such corners. Harvest and weather made better sense when spoken to in company with flame. You touch 2 fingers to the thyme and press them to the stone. You do not ask for much, only for the figs to keep their sweetness close, and for the swarms, when they must travel, to prefer the road beyond your wall. You promise to keep the ditch clean and the lamps trimmed, to lift the melon cloths at dusk, to do your part of the work so that the blessing knows where to land. A fringe tidbit nestles into the ritual because old habits enjoy company. You lay a blue bead beside the sprig, the kind traded for buttons and worn at wrists, said to turn sharp looks dull, and send the eye that would sour a field back to its owner. Some fix such beads to gateposts with a twist of wire. You prefer to leave yours here where it can cool its bright gaze. Once, in a rash season, you tied a shred of red wool to a fig twig in this same quiet, telling the tree to keep its heart steady. Whether the color convinced the air to behave is a story you tell only when the jar of wine is already empty. You stand in the hush and let the little flames slow your breath. Ants negotiate the shelf's edge with admirable caution. Skirting the salt and deciding the time is not a map they can read. A gecko appears at the far corner, finds nothing to eat, and becomes a pale comma on the wall. From beyond the garden, a thin bell rings the kind a goat wears. When the herd drifts toward evening, the sound arrives, folds once, and rests. You lay 3 pebbles in a row before the lamp, each chosen without thinking from the path. One smooth as the inside of a wrist, one pocked like old bread, one shaped like a grain of barley grown sudden and hard. You stack them into a small cairn the height of your thumb, a habit you learned from a neighbor who stacked stones whenever thanks outweighs speech. The cairn leans slightly forward, as if bowing. The wall here carries more than soot. In its mortar, a faint scratched sign hides 2 diagonal lines crossed by a third, something your father cut with a nail on an evening, when the olives had suffered and the rain refused to learn manners. He called it a reminder, not a charm, though he pressed his palm to it whenever he passed. Historians still argue how much of the old countryside's protective customs continue here in your century, and how much scholars, rather than villagers, have stitched together from niches, lamp soot, beads, and fragments of incised lines. They can list the things amulets against the evil eye, knotted cords, written slips tucked into cracks, but they cannot always tell you which belonged to which house, or which meant comfort, and which meant command. You place a fig bead, no more than a dry drop of last year's fruit you kept for sweetness, beside the blue glass. It sticks a little to the stone and looks suddenly ceremonial, though you meant it only as a promise to yourself to eat. Later, something that reminds you the world grows sugar on trees when it has the patience. A little breeze finds the lamp and wobbles the flame without asking permission. You fold your palm as a shield until it steadies. Then, you take the reed you brought and trace a small circle in the dust at the base of the niche. Not to trap anything, only to suggest a border where kindness should stand. The circle is not perfect. You let it be so on purpose. Plants do not draw perfect circles. Gardens mistrust them. You remember a tale from the stonemason who sometimes shares your noon shade? He swore his aunt hammered a scorpion flat upon the lintel one summer to warn its kin. You will never try that. The story still brings a shiver into your wrist. You prefer the gentler nonsense salt lines, blue beads, thyme sprigs, a lamp's modest grammar. If a charm requires cruelty, let it find another door. From the path a child's laugh carries, and then vanishes in the thick warm air. You take the bead into your palm and warm it with your skin, then set it back. The lamp's light has climbed enough to paint the lower edge of the soot print in gold. The thyme, under heat, loosens a sweeter tone and becomes less thorn and more meadow. A plain, careful fact keeps you company while you stand. Offerings in gardens rarely travel far. A sprig dries to pale memory by morning. A pebble learns to look like any other pebble. Lamp soot gives the wall a winter of faint rain. Yet these small things reorder your hands in the hours that follow. You walk more slowly and see more quickly. You treat the melon covers as if they could hear. You keep the ash ring neat around the cabbages, not from fear, but from the modest pride of a place tended under a watching light. You pinch the wick shorter with a wetted finger so the flame burns cleaner. Wax from the beekeeper softens under your thumb. You rub a breath of it on the lip so the lamp will not spit at you later. The gecko departs without a farewell. A moth touches the edge of the niche, decides it has misread the direction, and turns toward the fig row, where your evening lamps wait to argue with it. You press your thumb into the shelf where the soot darkens, leaving the faintest whorl that no one else will see. Then you bow your head just enough to teach your neck humility, and you gather what you brought. The reed, unburned, the empty salt cloth, the basket now carrying a stem-shaped memory of time. The bead remains. The stones hold their leaning bow. The lamp keeps its small sun. Historians agree that blessings and blight lived side by side in the minds of people who worked the soil here, that prayer and practice were not separate rooms but the same courtyard at different hours. They agree, too, that gardens wore their owners' hopes in soot and scratches as honestly as in trellises and ditches. What they cannot agree, on what they still argue, is how those hopes sounded when spoken aloud, whether in psalms under a cross or in older murmurs wrapped in herbs and light. You do not press the point. You press time. You press your thumb. You press the wick shorter. The garden hears what it needs. When you turn away, you leave the lamp to finish its small sermon to the stone. The path back to the beds is the same path as ever, only calmer under your feet. The air tastes faintly of thyme and warm clay. You pass the melon cloths, the basil border, the olive bark you scraped, and each thing looks somewhat more itself, as if the lamp's modest circle followed you out and spread thinly over the garden. You are ready for evening now, the counting, the checking, the quiet work done by lamps and hands and luck. The sun leans westward now, and the garden's edges begin to breathe again. You move toward the far plot where the lentils grow, their stems thin but stubborn, carrying pods that hang like small dry notes on a line. This bed has been the week's quiet watcher. No great swarms here, only the slow nibble of tiny green beetles that arrive in modest numbers but leave their mark if ignored. You crouch at the nearest row, the soil still holding some warmth from the day, and press your hand flat against it. The heat rises faintly through your skin, not enough to burn, but enough to make you imagine what it must feel like to a beetle who has carried the sun on its back since morning. You tilt one stem toward you and see the small holes in the leaf, nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to warn you that their patience is longer than yours. Historians agree that lentils were a staple in 5th-century Syrian diets, valued for their keeping quality and their ability to grow in poorer soils. In gardens like yours, they were both food and insurance, there when figs failed, there when olives were stingy. They also note that the humble lentil attracted few pests compared to more delicate crops, though those that did arrive could linger stubbornly. You pinch one beetle gently between your fingers and drop it into the shallow clay bowl you keep for this task. The bowl is lined with fine ash. The beetles find it too dry to escape, and you will tip them into the compost later, where heat will finish what you began. You repeat this along the row, moving slowly so your shadow falls ahead of your hand. Sometimes the beetles see the shadow first and drop to the soil, playing dead until you nudge them into the bowl. A fringe trick learned from an old trader comes to mind, shaking the stems lightly over a flat cloth so that pests fall, then folding the cloth quickly to carry them away. You tried it last season, and though it caught more beetles, it also tangled the lentils badly, leaving them in a sulk for days. You prefer the slower, gentler method, even if it means fewer trophies in the bowl. Halfway down the row, you pause to check the base of a plant where two stems lean together. Here, under the shade of their own leaves, a spider has strung a small net, delicate but serviceable. One beetle is caught already, its green shell dull in the web's fine mesh. You leave it undisturbed, stepping carefully around so as not to break the lines. The spider waits motionless, likely weighing whether to mend the net before nightfall. Historians still argue whether encouraging spiders in food crops was intentional in your time or merely tolerated. The webs help certainly, but the sticky threads can be troublesome when harvesting. Your own opinion is simple. Anything that eats what you don't want is welcome, provided it minds its manners. By the time you reach the end of the bed, the clay bowl carries a modest collection. You set it on a flat rock near the compost heap. where the ash will dry the beetles further before you dispose of them. The lentils stand lighter for your visit, their leaves shifting faintly as if they had been holding their breath. You run your hand once more along a row, feeling the way the pods bump gently against your palm. Each pod is a small rattle, promising the soft weight of dry grain in a few weeks. You think of the stew it will make, thickened with onions and seasoned with thyme from the slope, the steam curling like the lamp's smoke against the kitchen wall. The light now falls in narrow bands between the olive trunks, each band a small path for the air to follow. You take one of those paths back toward the center of the garden, feeling the day shift under your feet. Evening is near, and the garden, though quieter, is not finished speaking. There are still lamps to light, still cloths to lift, still the night's first watch to take. Evening presses gently on the walls, laying a softer gold across the stones. You walk the perimeter one last time, carrying the small clay lamps in a shallow tray, their wicks trimmed earlier. Wait for the first match of flame. The air smells different now, cooler at the edges, but still holding the day's dust and the resin of warm leaves. Somewhere beyond the grove, a donkey calls once, then decides the conversation is over. At the melon bed, you lift the cloths so they rest just above the leaves. The plants seem to stretch in the sudden air, their vines shifting as though in a slow greeting. You bend to check for new nibble marks, none yet. A single moth passes, undecided about where it belongs. You watch it cross the bed, its wings pale enough to catch the last light before disappearing into shadow. Historians agree that in 5th century Syria, garden lamps were not only for light, but for protection, both practical and symbolic. A lamp near a valued plant discouraged night-feeding insects and small animals wary of movement and glow. It also marked the gardener's care, as though the flame itself was a quiet watchman. You set the first lamp at the corner of the bed and breathe on the wick before lighting it, an old habit learned without explanation. The flame blooms, small but steady, and the lamp's body begins to warm. You place two more along the border, spacing them so their light overlaps in soft pools. The melon leaves catch a faint shine, their edges outlined against the darker soil. In the olive grove, you kneel to set another lamp on a flat stone near the scraped bark. The wound gleams slightly in the lamplight, the shavings curled where they fell. You touch the trunk once with your palm, feeling the cooler temperature that comes with night. The flame here flickers more than the others. A breeze has begun, slow and deliberate, carrying the smell of dry grass. A fringe tidbit from your neighbor drifts back to you. If you place a pinch of ground cumin in the oil, she claims, the lamp will burn longer, and the scent will confuse winged pests. You tried it last season, and while you cannot swear it lengthened the flame's life, you enjoyed the smell enough to do it again tonight. The oil takes the cumin easily, releasing a warm spice note that mingles with the olives. You light the remaining lamps at key places, one beside the thyme slope, one by the cabbages, and a final pair at the pomegranate grove's edge. The grove itself is darker now, the fruit still green but swelling, each one a tight promise. The lamps give the grove a boundary, small suns that say, this far, not farther. Historians still argue how much the light itself deterred pests, and how much the ritual of placing and tending the lamps shaped a gardener's sense of control. You know only that the act feels complete, that once the lamps are lit, the garden is no longer alone. You return to the central path and look around. Each pool of light has its own personality. The steady glow at the melons, the restless flicker in the grove, the sharp-edged beam by the thyme. Shadows stretch longer, their edges softer as the sun drops below the far hills. Above, the first star appears, faint but steady, as if joining the lamps in their watch. You take the empty tray back to the shed, brushing the dust from your hands. The night insects have begun their thin music, a sound that will grow until it fills the garden like water. You let it rise, knowing that within each lamp's reach, the plants rest a little easier. The day's work is finished not with a closing of doors, but with the setting of light. You walk once more along the path, this time without bending to inspect or to mend. The lamps burn, the air cools, and the garden, for now, belongs to the night. The garden exhales as the last light slips away. You stand still long enough for your eyes to adjust, for the gold to become silver. for the outlines of leaf and branch to soften into shapes the night understands. The lamps hold their glow, each a quiet island in a sea of shadow. You could walk without them, but their presence changes the way the paths feel familiar, cared for, and slightly apart from the rest of the world. A breeze finds its way through the pomegranate grove, moving the leaves so slowly it sounds more like thought than wind. Beyond the wall, an owl calls once, a brief curve of sound that drifts above the olive trees and is gone. Somewhere near the shed, a gecko makes its quick, dry steps over the stone, searching for its meal in the lamplight. You walk toward the thyme slope and sit on the low wall. The air smells of crushed herbs and warm clay, a scent that will fade by morning but feels endless now. Insects hum in the distance, their patterns weaving in and out of one another until the sound becomes a single thread. Your hands rest in your lap, open and loose. You have no tools now, no baskets, no lists. The day has been folded into the soil, into the ash rings, into the leaves brushed clean by the breeze. You have done the work that could be done, and the rest belongs to the night and to the slow passing of hours. When you rise, it is not because anything calls you, but because the garden is already asleep, and you are only a guest in its dreaming. You step inside, leaving the lamps to burn their quiet sentences until dawn. We hope this steady drift through the rougher edges of history has been a gentle one. If it's left you thoughtful, you're welcome to like, share, or write a calm comment. And if you'd like to linger longer in the past, you can subscribe for the next slow story. End of script. Sweet dreams.